We'll make a start. What I want to discuss now, as I said before the break, is the DS5 mitigated scenario, and I'll run through, I think, what would be helpful to focus on there. But just to focus the minds of myself particularly and everybody else around the room, I do need to get through this agenda today, even if it means sitting a bit late. And so I'm hoping that we can soon move on to the sort of recreational activity urbanisation effects before at the end sort of looking to the extent that we can at the DM management policies. And again, I expect it might be necessary to come back on some of these issues in some way, but I'm very keen today to sort of not miss out any of these policies so that I can at least get a sort of overview of the main points for consideration in all areas. So I hope that's okay with everybody. And I know there's been a lot of detail to discuss and all of it's useful, but again, if we can sort of focus to make sure that we get through the agenda, and if you can help me in that, and I'll try my best to focus myself, then that would be really helpful. So moving on with DS5, the mitigated scenario, again, I think what would be helpful, what I've thought that I want to hear about, and again, if there's anything you think I'm missing, then do chip in and say that, but it would be useful to me to know precisely what mitigation has been modelled. So I can't remember the paragraph in here now, but there's a list of policies, 6.18, something like that. There's a list of policies that are talked about as the mitigation in the plan, some of them relating to modal shift, that sort of thing, DM2, DM22. So my question is, I suppose, what specific allowance has been made for any of those policies, or are these all additional things on top of the autonomous measures, essentially the 2030 emissions factors? And then, again, if you can explain why you've used the 2023 factors in DS2, but the 2030 factors in DS5. I think that's a key point of dispute around the room. And then, just from having a quick glance at the proposed amendments to policy DM22, there's mention of an air quality mitigation strategy, which I don't think has come up yet so in our discussion. So if you can talk a little bit about that would be helpful. So I think, again, if people think there's anything really fundamental missing there that you can't cover, then let me know now. Otherwise, I'll ask the Council if it could take me through DS5 in those terms, and then we'll come back to others around the table. Thank you. Dr. Riley?
Thank you. I won't go through the results of DS5 because they've already been described and you all have a paper copy summarising those results. So with specific regard to our approach to how we went about it, I think it's first, and this is acknowledged, I think it's worth saying, that it is extremely difficult to model in detail, in terms of precise changes in flows, for example, the effects of the kinds of mitigation measures that are available to a local plan to deliver as part of their mitigation strategy. Professor Laxton's company, Air Quality Consultants, has done a review of this topic for another local authority, and they've looked into this in detail and have reached a similar conclusion, that you cannot provide detailed, precise changes in flow. So, for example, our actual vehicle charging points, we can't come up with a precise number of vehicles or the amount of share that we can give. However, taking that into account, we do have the DEFRA emission factor toolkit. DEFRA, and this relates to your 2023-2030 point as well, DEFRA has produced the toolkit to assist local authorities in forecasting air quality in a given future year. DEFRA considers the emission factor toolkit enables an accurate forecast of future air quality without any local interventions. So it doesn't rely on anything specific of the kind that we're talking about being done. However, as we have already discussed, it is considered there is some residual doubt about the later of those projections without further measures being taken at the local level, which is why we have used 2023 emission factors to represent 2033 in the absence of growth and, of course, the absence of mitigation. And is also what lies behind Natural England, for example, agreeing with us taking that interim year approach because of that uncertainty about the delivery of the later factors. However, the local initiatives we are planning will minimise that doubt for Epping Forest District, either directly with regard to stimulating the shift in vehicle fleet composition via uptake of electric vehicles, or indirectly by reducing vehicle trips through improved public transport and non-motorised transport measures, bearing in mind that our unmitigated traffic forecasts, as we've already discussed, are very much a worst case. And also taking into account that the DEFRA emission factor toolkit assumptions that we have used for our modelling make no allowance for electric vehicles in the baseline scenario. So everything we're doing with regard to electric vehicles is above and beyond. So our package of measures is not entirely autonomous from the fleet composition changes and related projections underlying the emission factor toolkit for 2030, but in our view is necessary to bring them about. If we are all agreed, as I think most of us are, that the 2030 emission factor toolkit has some uncertainty over the later elements of its assumptions, for example, with regard to vehicle fleet composition and the shift to Euro 6 vehicles, the 2030 emission standards assume 99% of vehicles will be Euro 6 compliant, cars and vans, I beg your pardon, will be Euro 6 compliant by then. In our baseline modelling, we've been much more cautious and assumed 80% of cars will be Euro 6 compliant, for example. The mitigation measures that we are providing, while we cannot specifically quantify each measure, they are all there to remove that residual uncertainty about achieving the full complement of measures that lies behind the projections set out by the emission factor toolkit. That's our position.
Okay, again, so just to test my own understanding of what you've said, you haven't sort of ascribed a particular benefit to any individual measure in particular.
In quantitative terms, that's correct.
So you haven't said, oh, because there's... So for example, we're reading somewhere that in the Garden Towns was reading about there being an aim for a 60% change in vehicle. So you haven't sort of said, oh, because of all of this, we're going to assume a 60% reduction.
No, that's right. In terms of specific quantification for each measure, because there is no methodology to do that
Right.
with regard to flows on individual particular roads. So therefore, any assumptions we made would be ones that we had ourselves devised and therefore by definition would be open to dispute. The emission factor toolkit is not devised by us, obviously. That's something that the DEFRA has devised. They did not devise it for this purpose, clearly. But the point is that the factors, the underlying assumptions regarding vehicle fleet composition and various other things that underlie the factors that they produce will be more fully realised, i.e. will be realised with our measures in place than they would be in an unmitigated scenario, hence why we're using 2030, 2023.
Okay. So essentially, the mitigation measures that you list in the plan, DM22, T1, all these sorts of things, you're taking account of those in a way to justify the use of the 2030 measures. You're not ascribing a particular benefit to any individual one of those, but you're saying that with those, it reduces the uncertainty that the 2030 emission factors will not be achieved.
I wouldn't necessarily express it exactly the way you did, but our view is that everybody's view is that the 2030 emission factors would not be appropriate for an unmitigated baseline scenario, but with the mitigation measures that we are building in with regard to changes in vehicle fleet composition, etc., they make the application of those 2030 factors much more reasonable and likely to occur. And that is a calculation method that is not produced by us, it's independent, it's available by government. I don't think there is another tool available. And so that is the approach we've undertaken. You know, in other areas, an approach has been taken simply to make no attempt at all to forecast what air quality would be with the mitigation measures in place. But we didn't feel that was adequate.
And you said that you accepted that the emissions toolkit was not devised for this purpose. What purpose is it for?
The DEFRA's emission factor toolkit is used to report to the local air quality management procedure. The underlying information is from the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory, which the information within that is used to report to the EU on the Air Quality Directive and National Emission Ceiling Directive, so the information is considered to be robust.
Thank you. Before we move around the room, I think the only question you didn't address was the air quality mitigation strategy.
Yes, Madam, if I can address you on that. The mitigation strategy we're preparing deals with two aspects: the recreational impacts, which an interim mitigation strategy was agreed by Cabinet last year on the 18th of October 2018, and I'm sure we'll come back to talk about that. We have been also developing a draft strategy for air quality. There was a report to Cabinet on the 11th of April 2019 at EB 142A, which sets out the elements that we were proposing to include within the air quality strategy, and sought to get approval from Cabinet to give delegated authority to the portfolio holder to agree the air quality strategy as soon as possible. A draft of the strategy has been sent to Natural England for their comments, so it's not actually in the public domain at the moment. We're waiting to get comments from Natural England on the proposed strategy, but obviously as soon as we've got their initial comments, we will also be wanting to consult with other key stakeholders on the strategy before we develop it further.
Broadly, what are its intentions? What is it seeking to do in addition to the measures that are already in the plan? Just give us a flavour of it.
It's highlighting a lot of the measures that are in the plan, but essentially, I mean, we've heard about electric vehicle charging points, looking at travel information packs for new occupiers and development, a commitment to develop a sustainable transport strategy to maximise opportunities for travelling by means other than the car. We will also be seeking contributions towards ongoing monitoring of air quality within the Epping Forest SAC, and we see that as a key element, and I think we will be discussing with you on Thursday as part of the infrastructure policies monitoring and review arrangements for the local plan, obviously bearing in mind the changes to the requirement to review plans every 5 years, but also to put in triggers for review, and we will be looking to see whether or not, you know, the monitoring that we do on the air quality of the forest should be a trigger for that as well. So there's a whole package of measures, but the measures don't just include measures that we can take as local planning authority, but measures that might be taken more widely through our other functions, and indeed with partners too. Yeah, I did.
Thank you. Mr. Laxon.
Thank you. Yes, I think it needs to be clear exactly what the purpose of 2023 was in the DS2 scenario. That was to take account of the fact that the emission factors for some future cars, Euro 6 cars coming on the road from 2020 may not be achieved, and therefore they held the future emissions at 2023 levels, which is largely based on the vehicles that are on the road now that we know the emissions of. And therefore 2023 was used to come up with a better estimate of 2033 emissions that we can be more certain about, but there's still uncertainty about those. So to say that we should be, by applying a mitigation strategy, moving to 2030 emission factors has no basis at all, because that would be saying that we're allowing for vehicles that aren't on the road now to come onto the road and reduce the emissions. So it's not an appropriate use of the emission factors in the emission factor toolkit to try and model, say that that is modelling mitigation that could be achieved. those factors don't relate to any of the mitigation measures at all. And it's also, I should add, not true that you can't model some mitigation options. Some are very difficult, such as what role does encouraging cycling and walking have in terms of reducing vehicle numbers. That's very difficult, but there are some mitigation measures, and Natural England set out this morning some possibilities for restricting traffic through the forest. I could envisage a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit through the forest that could reduce emissions. There could be a clean air zone where only Euro 6 vehicles, diesel vehicles, are allowed through the forest, much like the clean air zone that's appearing in central London. So there are mitigation measures that could be modelled and included, and that would also include where you actually put the development sites. The traffic going through the forest will depend on where development sites are located, and that could be modelled as well, but it hasn't been.
Can I just ask you a question, Mr. Laxon? When you say that so there's 2030 emission factors, does that assume that every car on the road then would comply?
Yes, it does. It's a typical fleet of vehicles that will be on the road in that year, a typical mix in that year.
Can you give, from your experience of doing similar work, can you give me any idea of how, if it's not appropriate to almost, I know that Mr. Riley disagreed with quite the terminology I'd use, but it's more because I can't think of how else to express it, but in a way to justify using, to take the package of measures to say things are going to improve because of this package of measures, and therefore it's reasonable to rely on the 2030 factors. In your experience, how might you take account of the mitigation, the various factors, the various policy interventions that the council is proposing? Because presumably, I know there's dispute over the extent to which they will help, and obviously there's a question of certainty there, but I assume we can all think that there would be some benefit. How might they go about allowing for that benefit in a more justifiable way?
I believe that they would need to attempt to quantify the measures that they're proposing to put into the mitigation strategy. And then if those measures will reduce the traffic on the roads, or in particular the roads going through the forest, they can model that. If those measures were going to move people from cars to public transport, that could be included, although that would need to be done with great care because, as the council itself recognises, the public transport in this area, it tends to use older vehicles, which would probably increase the pollution within the forest rather than reduce it. So I think they would need to make best attempts at quantifying the mitigation measures that they were proposing. And then test them out and see where that might take them. Are they anywhere near achieving what they want to achieve, or are they potentially miles off? We know that many of the softer approaches, such as cycling and walking, can achieve some change, modal shift change, some reduction in traffic, but it's usually in a few percent. If they're needing to achieve a sort of a large reduction in emissions, then those approaches will not actually achieve it.
Thank you. Anyone on this side of the table?
Thank you.
Mr. Graham.
So I'm just going to briefly run through our headline points with DS5. The key point is it was said earlier, and there's now a note of what was said earlier by Mr. Riley, that the DS5 will not just mitigate the plan, but will be an acceleration of improvements beyond what there would be if there was no development, no planned development at all. Now, as a matter of common sense, that can't be right because all the mitigation policies that are in the plan will only, by definition, be applied to new development that's coming forward in the plan period. The reason he says that is what is shown is because of this emissions factor for 2030 being applied to all traffic, including all the existing traffic, the background traffic that would have existed apart from the plan. So that's how you get to figures for NOx, for instance, which are slightly lower than would have been the case taking the baseline, which is 2023, but emissions factors, and assuming no additional development from the plan. So just as a matter of common sense, we're not modelling the what we're calling mitigation. We're modelling effectively just plugging in those emissions factors from 2030. Now, those emissions factors for 2030, they are a sort of national best guess at what an average fleet will look like. We're told that they've used the rural fleet, and that's what they are. So they're not purporting to be a prediction about what the fleet will be like around Epping Forest. That's the first point. And secondly, they are a guess, they're a reasonable prediction, but they are only a prediction, and they've not been formulated in order to take into account of the sort of certainty that's required under the Habitats Directive. So no one has asked DEFRA to come up with a emissions factor that's for argument's sake, 90% certain to eventuate, or 95%. They haven't been asked to do that. They've given a reasonable, fair stab at what they predict at a national level. So we've got to ask ourselves, is there the evidence here to show that the Epping Forest emissions, total emissions, are going to equate to 2030 or beat it? And are we certain, beyond reasonable doubt, that that will happen by the end of our plan period? If we look at what the mitigation... Oh, and before I go into the policies, just to say that if the conversion factor that you're applying for vegetation is for tall vegetation, that means that the additional nitrogen deposition from traffic is multiplied by 3 for the plan, and so it then becomes more sensitive to the mitigation assumptions, because the mitigation assumptions, if they're only slightly out, there's going to be 3 times more extra emissions from the plan than has been assumed. So it's, if you like, there's more sensitivity. So then we come to look at, well, what are the measures that we're proposing that will get us to be sure that the 2030 figures will be will in fact materialise. If we look at what they actually are, Madam, and I won't ask you to do it now, but the policies such as they are entirely unremarkable policies along the lines of...
Sorry, I know that there's a page and a paragraph that sets them all out, and I can't
it's I think 6.18.
That's what I thought it was.
It's D...
Again, has anyone got a page? Yes, 154. 154, thank you very much. Sorry, carry on, Mr. Graham.
I'll catch up as well. 154, did we say?
Yep.
So if we look at what they are, in general terms, saying that development has got to mitigate for air quality impacts. They're exactly the sort of policies that one finds in the existing development plan. They are standard policies that you would hope and expect to see in a development plan, which say that unacceptable environmental impacts won't be permitted. But we've got to ask ourselves, does that make us any more or less certain to hit the 2030 projections, then, for instance, what's in the current development plan? And I ask rhetorically, well, why are we any more certain? Because they're there. So that's the concern, really, is can we be certain that the projections will actually reflect the sum total of the application of these policies, bearing in mind that the policies themselves only apply to new development within Epping, and so we have to look at, there's an uncertainty around what the other traffic will do that isn't from new development, and also what this traffic will do. So in a sense, that's it. Now, in terms of these policies, you can't quantify the impacts of the current proposals because they're too nebulous. They don't say we're going to have, for instance, a charging zone that's only going to allow Euro 6 vehicles. If you had that, then you could assume that it's going to be enforced, potentially, if you've got an indication of the enforcement, and you could assume that all of the vehicles will be compliant, or 85% will be compliant, or something, but you'd have some basis of quantifying that. We haven't really got that here for any of them. The specific measure, which is somewhat more unusual, is to require new development to have electric charging points installed. The policy doesn't require any particular number of those, but the difficulty there is, as we've said in our note, that the availability of the charging point isn't the key factor that's preventing people buying electric cars today. It's the increasing cost of actually purchasing the electric car compared to a internal combustion car. So it's hard to see that you could give very much allowance in terms of percentage reduction to that sort of measure on its own. And as Professor Laxon has said, there are other measures, there are other policies that talk about active modes, sustainable development and so on. Those, again, are reflected effectively in existing planning guidance and policy. And it's always been the case that we're encouraging walking and cycling, but the question is, can we rely on that to the requisite degree of certainty? I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Chapman.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add into that, that there is just a sort of standard approach to how we deal with mitigation under the habitats regulations. So generally speaking, there's a lot of case law to say that to be taken into account, mitigation has to be effective, it has to be reliable, you have to have confidence that it's going to actually work in the long term, all these sorts of factors. So when we're looking at policies such as these that are here, they simply just don't provide that reassurance that actually they can be relied upon to deliver. And I'm not going to talk in certainty because we're not looking for absolute certainty, but there needs to be sufficient confidence that they remove the reasonable scientific doubt that remains when you're looking at the DS2 scenario. And it's that level of the extent to which they will be able to remove that reasonable scientific doubt that was there. And that uncertainty comes down to the confidence with which we can attribute this, the emission factors applying to all vehicles on the road. Now, I think great weight is put on the ability of some fairly vague plan policies to influence all the traffic that is going to be on the roads going through Epping Forest, because that's essentially what is being argued. And if you don't have that ability to be able to sort of remove that reasonable scientific doubt, you've got to go back and you sort of have to rerun yourself at the integrity test and the appropriate assessment. And the question for you as the inspector, be your judgment to make, is whether applying DS5 removes, whether those plan policies give you the confidence that removed the doubt as to why we didn't apply the 2030 emission factors at DS2. And that's the point at which I have real concerns that those policies themselves don't give you that confidence to say we can now apply those 2030 factors.
Thank you. Mr. Pereira.
Thank you. Can we, first of all, endorse what Natural England have said, and then I'm going to add some points of my own. Firstly, it's worth remembering why we're focusing on DS5, and particularly in the context of Dr. Riley's comment that it's difficult to model the effects of local plan mitigation. As Professor Laxman said, that depends on the mitigation. And the reason we're focusing on this is because there was originally physical mitigation that you commented on at the beginning, which can't proceed, partly because one aspect of it actually involved taking land from the SAC. So it's again a feature of the presence of the SAC that there isn't more certain mitigation that can be proposed. This is the best that there is. So that's how we get here. So it wasn't ever the intention of the plan maker to rely upon a DS5 scenario. The intention of the planning authority was to rely upon certain physical infrastructure, which it later realised it couldn't rely on. And that's why we're forced into the DS5 circumstance. So that's the first point. Secondly, then, we have these factors that relate to fleet composition, and it's accepted by everyone here. They are not reliable enough to use in DS2 for their full purpose. That's why there's a cutting back to the 2023. So they're not reliable enough to use to 2030 for the purpose for which they were designed, that's to say for looking at air quality in DS2. But, says the Council, they are reliable enough to use for a different purpose in DS5. And that's quite a big jump to say they're not reliable enough to 2030 in DS2, but we can use them and they are reliable enough for DS30 in DS5 to 2030. And if I've understood it correctly, the Council is saying is, we're not going to use them for the unreliable purpose, the reason why we haven't used them in DS2. We're going to use them for an entirely different purpose, which is as a proxy for the generalised mitigation measures in the plan policies, which, as Mr. Graham has said, are policies that you'd expect to find and probably do find in the existing plan. So it's very difficult to see how that makes sense. They're not reliable enough to use for what they were designed for, but somehow they are reliable enough to use for an entirely different purpose, which is to stand in for the inability to model the actual mitigation measures in the plan. And there isn't really any analysis or assessment that enables you or anyone else to see how they can be reliable for that purpose, to stand in as a proxy for the plan policies, particularly when they're not reliable for their own purpose. That's the DS the reason why they're not used in DS2. So, obviously, AECOM come from a place of good intention. Don't deny that. But when one actually looks at the judgments that are being reached and accepting it's the best that can be done on the evidence we've got, there's actually nothing there to underpin those judgments. It's a guess, a well-intentioned guess perhaps, but it's a guess. And as I said before, the question isn't, has the plan-making authority done the best it can? The question is, can we exclude reasonable scientific doubt? And we can't.
Thank you. Mr. Pinnock.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just to endorse both those contributions, there are no measures, as has been said, to actually understand the effect of, and there are several points which we picked up in the Matter 13 transportation session. So I think several of the issues that Telelands have raised will be dealt with then separately. There is, I think, a question about the consistency between the air quality scenarios and the transportation scenarios, and we would like to understand to what extent they are the same scenarios. But there is the far more fundamental point that against the standard of no scientific doubt, effectively reasonable doubt, there isn't sufficient evidence in the evidence base to actually reach a conclusion on what the proper strategy is. And we would endorse what Natural England have said in relation to the degree of confidence in mitigation, which is the relevant test, and the Council have relied in the HRA on the relevant cases. But in the absence of actually understanding what the measures are, and we're told that the whole package of measures, which the Council referred to, when you asked what mitigation has been modelled, when you work your way down and actually get to the answer that was given, the whole package of measures were electric vehicles, the merits of which and reliability of which for scientific forecasting we've heard about, travel information packs, and a commitment to a future strategy. I mean, that is remarkable that is the evidence base and that's even described as mitigation. So it's not mitigation.
I want to come back and ask, I get that point, and I've got a question for the council which I want to ask. Perhaps I'll ask it now in case we're going to hear the same thing again. I mean, from what I've heard, it perhaps does seem that there's no very direct link between the measures proposed and the achievement of the 2030 emission factors. So I don't know whether you can say a bit more about that. I mean, that's what I'm getting that point from around the table. I want the council to come back on that. Is there any? Well, give the council another opportunity if you like to answer that. Is there anything different, Mr. Lowry?
Yeah, the DEFRA figures are national. I wonder if any context has been given for local geography. Some of our settlements have very steep slopes, have very narrow roads. These would indicate cycling and walking are going to be difficult mitigations to achieve.
Thank you. Again, anything different before we sort of ask the council to sort of come back on that fairly fundamental point that's been raised in different ways but several times?
I've just got a very short point that I meant to make and I didn't, so it'll take me about 20 seconds.
Okay.
Just so that you can understand the weight that's being placed on this particular assumption or set of assumptions, when you look back to Mr. Riley's second and third paragraphs on the sheet he handed out, you will see what will strike many around the table as the quite surprising proposition that growth through the plan actually leads to an accelerated rate of improvement compared to no growth. And
Yeah.
that really does show you the weight that is being placed on this very peculiar set of assumptions.
Actually, that's another point perhaps I could ask you to come back on, I think, because you did say it, but it does seem, I'm not sure that there's nothing, is the point that there's nothing additional being proposed other than a reliance on the 2030 emission factors, so that will happen anyway, presumably, if we accept that they should be used, it's justified to use them, that's going to happen anyway. Nothing that the plan's proposing is going to speed anything up.
But it isn't, of course, the basis of anybody's contention here that the 2030 emission factors will happen anyway. That's why we're using the 2023 factors to represent 2033. Okay. Our contention is that extra work would be needed to bring about those 2030 emission factors. There was a reference by Professor Laxon earlier to the difference in emissions between, without going into too much technical detail, Euro 6D diesel vehicles and Euro 6C diesel vehicles, and whether one will be better than the other. And that is indeed an assumption underlying their cured, air quality consultants' cured tool. But they also state in that cured tool there is no strong basis for doubting the assumptions made in the emission factor toolkit with regard to the performance of Euro 6C and D vehicles. With regard to our use of 2023 emission factors, with regard to 2030, for example, one example of what you were saying about how it would be related to it is that there are commitments within the plan to deliver electric vehicle charging points, and they're also within the emerging mitigation strategy. They're also examining the feasibility of applying that to council car parks as well. So there is an example there of stimulating the further uptake of Euro 6 vehicles in our 2023 factors. In our modelling for our baseline, we have assumed, for example, only 80% of cars will be Euro 6 compliant by 2033. Electric vehicles are inherently Euro 6 compliant because they don't emit pollution in that way. Therefore, an increased proportion of electric vehicles would provide that additional kick, if you like, to achieve the difference between what we have allowed for by 2030, i.e. the 80% of cars, for example, and the 99%, but they allow for within the Euro 6, within the emission factor toolkit for that year. So there is a link there. There was a mention made to the fact that these measures will only relate to what is being undertaken, to new development. And I would point out that in policy T1, and again, to be developed more through the mitigation strategy that's being worked on, there is reference to improvements to strategic road and rail connections and other public transport networks to the wider area, improvements to public transport services and supporting infrastructure, providing coherent and direct cycling and walking networks, improving access to the 2 town and 4 small district centres and rail stations by all modes of transport, and ensure good integration between transport mode, the introduction of revised stringent parking standards that I believe the council is rolling out. All of those would not just apply to new residents, they would apply to existing residents and existing motorists who dominate the traffic links that we're talking about. I would also mention, just one particular technical point, with regard to a point that Natural England made about, again, bringing up this deposition velocity. Just to clarify, whatever deposition velocity we use, the emissions do not change. That is related to how the emissions are converted to nitrogen. So the mitigation measures are addressing the emissions, so that particular point doesn't affect the, or otherwise, the mitigation effectiveness. Yes, and that would, you know, that is what I would say in response to that. The only thing I would add further with regard to Professor Laxon's comments early on, and his comments that, you know, there are measures that can be mitigated, that can be modelled. In Ashdown Forest at the moment, his company is working on a mitigation strategy down there with the local planning authority, and they are proposing very similar measures, and as far as I can see, there's been no attempt made to model the effect of the mitigation. The council has simply asserted it will be effective. We have, as I said earlier, we felt that was an unacceptable approach, so we have gone further to identify the best way in order to represent what air quality would be with these measures in place, which is not to say that we are claiming that these measures will deliver an absolutely equivalent benefit to the 2030 emission factors. They reduce that residual doubt. Sorry,
Thank you. And Mr. Pinnock has another point to make, and I don't want any more comments on this particularly now. I just wanted to check my understanding of what you're saying. It's essentially, so when I asked, it seemed that there was no direct link between the measures proposed and the achievement of the emission factors. What you're saying is that the measures that you're proposing are sort of there to induce or to provide the necessary means and encouragement for people to take up the right types of cars, and whilst that might not equate to an exact achievement of those, it reduces the risk that it won't. Would you say, does it meet the the reasonable scientific doubt?
Yes, in as much as
Test.
because it is about bringing about the emissions factor, but bringing about DEFRA's forecasts for what air quality would be in 2030, in which they have confidence. My colleagues already mentioned the fact that the emissions factor toolkit is used, or the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory data that underlies it is used for our reporting to the European Union, for example. So they're not just numbers they flung out there; they are intended to have some credibility behind them.
Okay. Thank you. Take any different points. Again, I know that people disagree with that from what you've said, so there's no benefit in going around disagreeing with that. So, but Mr. Pinnock, do you have an additional different point to make?
It was the second part of what I'd started with originally, so I'll just finish very briefly. And the query that I raised was in relation to the degree of consistency between the transportation scenarios and the air quality scenarios. So we can raise that in the context of Thursday's session if it's easier, but it would be helpful if the council is able to confirm that today, that those are two completely compatible scenarios. But the second point I want to make was just very brief submissions just on the nature of the test we've got here and what's actually in the HRA, which touches back on what's just been said, because the reality is what we have is a package which is, as I say, limited to electric vehicles, travel information packs and the commitment to a future strategy. That's the mitigation, supposedly. And that's now described by the council as having some credibility. And then the test is there scientific doubt? And there's several scientists around the table saying that it's entirely dubious. So, leave that there. But it's an entirely speculative package, of probably something that can't even properly be described as mitigation. It's a finger in the air, it's guesswork. I'm sorry if that sounds cruel and slightly rude, but that is what it is, against what we open this session with, which is one of the most sensitive SACs of its kind in Europe. It's entirely inappropriate, we would say, as an assessment to understand whether it's the most appropriate strategy or whether there's likely to be an adverse effect. But the points I just wanted to raise very quickly were on the way that so that's the approach to the mitigation, methodologically, I suppose. And then there's a separate point, which is the nature of the conclusions actually reached by the HRA, which on its own terms don't give the confidence that Professor Chapman referred to in terms of confidence about deliverability and achievability in order to then ground a finding that there won't be those, or there's no, there's sufficient absence of doubt scientifically about the adverse effects. And Natural England share the concerns now that Teleland's raised originally, and they conclude in their hearing statement that there's no supporting evidence as the efficacy or certainty of delivery of the mitigation. That's the government's advisor saying that. And the HRA itself, an example at paragraph 2.21, it says a reasonable outcome would be from some of the things that have been modelled. That is not the right standard for an appropriate assessment, that one reasonable outcome might be something. And the HRA is peppered with those things, that the policies could result in reductions in recreational pressure context. There are options which people may contribute to that may have a particular effect. And throughout, the nature of the conclusions reached are so far below the standard required of appropriate assessment that the ability to then go on and use the appropriate assessment for the purpose which, unfortunately, you are required to, which is to decide for the purpose of the MPPF whether this is the most appropriate strategy, because the risk on the legal side is for the council in November or wherever. But those are the points I think that need to emerge from the way the HRA is phrased, as well as the way that the methodology is put together.
Thank you. If I can just, if we can take the remaining points, then I want to stop on air quality now and move on. But if we just take these last two remaining points.
That'd be fine. I just wanted to make a couple of points before we move off mitigation. Just to completely reiterate that what is put forward here in mitigation, and if we're accepting this in the context of a local plan, that these types of policies can be acceptable under the habitats regulations as mitigation, that, in my experience of having looked at an array of plans and policy measures, is precedent setting. And by way of comparison, so we got the European Court case has said, you cannot take account of future benefits of measures if scientific knowledge does not allow them to be quantified with certainty. That's the case that was quoted back by the council, and they've now accepted that they cannot quantify what they are referring to as mitigation measures. So if you put those to one side, we then, and I just think it's useful by way of comparison to look at the mitigation that is being put forward as being acceptable for recreational effects. Because you mentioned earlier about the idea of, well, it's still a modal shift, and we are dealing with future estimations, and we've got to allow a certain degree of flexibility in that. But the provision of a SANG, actually, in terms of the expectation that that will reduce recreational pressure, is there because it provides an alternative place for people to go to recreational purposes. The SANG is never put forward on the basis that all new residents will go there. It's about taking some new residents and existing residents and providing an alternative. Now, if policy T1 in this instance had said, we are committed to making improvements in the public transport and we will do that by delivering this scheme, an alternative route for cars to use, then you can put some sort of confidence that that will actually influence some sort of a modal shift. But simply saying we're committed to delivering some improvements, but without actually specifying what those might be, that is, I think, a real point of principle in terms of habitats regulations and what we do and don't need in local plans going forward.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to...
Mr. Graham.
Just very briefly, just to clear up something that arose this morning earlier on. It was the question about how those years of delay had been calculated. I was corrected and told that the 0.4 wasn't the assumption. We got that from a paragraph in the text. It appears that there wasn't an explanation as to how that had been derived in the text, so I'd propose to Mr. Riley that they produce a note on what figures were used and where that came from, so that that can inform your confidence around that delay question.
Thank you. Mr. Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. I wasn't quite sure whether to bring it up now, but I think it probably is a point. It's not about mitigation as much. It's taking up Mr. Pinnock's point about the confidence in the modelling of that underlies the air quality, and I just wanted to raise it now. There are differences between the Transport Assessment Report, EB 503, and the HRA, EB 209. They have used in EB 209, the HRA...
Sorry, is this directed to Mr. Pinnock's point as well? So are you... Because you're talking about the difference between the transport modelling, so this might be... Thank you.
It's just, in a sense, a question for AECOM and the Council, because it's a concern we obviously haven't submitted our transport work, but in looking through the differences between the two, which we've only done relatively recently, the VISIM model, which is the underscoring model, provides queue lengths which are in the HRA, and they're in the table. I forget, it's Appendix D, I think, of the HRA. But they're very short. Some of them are only a few metres long, some of them are up to 400 metres long. But they, even compared to today's figures, they look too short, based on my knowledge of queue lengths at the Wake Arms roundabout. The concern I've got is the discrepancy between those that have been used to model for the air quality are huge from the transport assessment, where under the different DS scenarios of the transport assessment, we can get up to 5 kilometre queues. But even with mitigation scenarios like DS4, we're down in, which involve physical mitigation, we've got queue lengths of 2.5 kilometres. And yet in the HRA modelling, we're dealing with nothing more than about 400 metres. And I simply can't understand that discrepancy. And one of the issues it throws out for me as a non-technical transport person is, first of all, what a concern about the HRA and what's underscoring the HRA modelling, and going back to the earlier discussion this morning about air quality, but also just the fact that the transport assessment, the overall assessment, hasn't done a sort of combined VISM and VISIM model, which certainly our transport models were saying perhaps should have been done across the whole site. And you've certainly got, with the transport assessment, very detailed figures. And the final point on that, not just the modelling, but the concern is that given those queue length, that discrepancy, I would have expected something like the AA perhaps to have gone out and done some actual look at, so actually measure for reality what the queues actually are now. A bit like the air quality monitoring has tried to at least measure what the air quality is now. And I think that's a concern for me. The modal shift point is just the final point I was going to make, because it's come up. The 8% modal shift is a very ambitious modal shift, and elsewhere that kind of level of modal shift, where it may have been or approached in something like Doncaster or Peterborough under the smarter choices, has involved tens of millions of pounds. I think £10 million for one of the schemes, and that's the kind of issue going to the sort of quantification of what's in the mitigation package, which is really key, I think. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. We'll take the two last points now, so no one else put their board up. And I don't want to take the discussion in a completely new direction now, if possible, please, because we do need to round up on this. Mr. Lowry.
Sorry, could I repeat my quest for some information on the air quality management area at Belcommon, please?
Yes, Madam, I can answer that very simply. The air quality management area consisted of one house at Belcommon.
And it is outside the model boundary of the SAC that we agreed to model with Natural England, so it's not relevant to the HRA assessment.
Thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, ma'am. These all relate to air quality, and I put the points that I've saved up, as I said I would, to the end, rather than interrupt the flow of the discussion. Three points only. The first is just to ask you to reflect on the cumulative effect of the repeated worst-case assumptions that the Council made in its initial traffic case in DS2, which I have to say I hadn't fully understood until Ms. Blom-Cooper set them out and described them as an overly worst case. Sitting round the table and hearing those one after the other, it does seem the Council have not done themselves any favours in starting from such an overly conservative and worst-case starting point. We are here, it seems to me, to try to make some sort of realistic assessment and real-world assessment of what's likely to happen in relation to the flows that would be generated by the allocated development in the plan. And the, I think, 5 or 6 assumptions that I wrote down all seemed to me to be excessively worst case and far removed from the real world. Now, quite what one does with that is a matter that you and the Council will perhaps have to reflect upon, but of course that is the starting point from which all this work has proceeded. And it seems to me that a more real world starting point, as one of those who has spent a lot of time and effort on this plan, and my clients have as well, we are anxious and concerned that so many worst case assumptions accumulate there to deliver the traffic flows and then the vehicular emissions associated with the plan. For example, all trips entirely new to the network seems to me to be a rather over-conservative starting point. Second point, and again I didn't take this at the time, I hope you'll forgive me for having waited to the end as I said I would, whether or not to use the dispersion equation for open ground or the forest. I'd simply ask you to reflect on the fact it's not really as simple as one or the other in Epping Forest, although it's called Epping Forest, as you will well have observed, I'm sure, ma'am, with your many visits here. It's not a dense pine forest or a proper forest in the fairy tale sense. It's a mosaic of habitats. Much of it is heathland, open glades, open ground, and it seems to me, I'm not going to stipulate which is the correct one, that it's probably somewhere in between. And I ask you again to reflect on that when you're looking at those matters. Last point in relation to mitigations and the discussion that we've just been having, the exchange we've just been having, we have some sympathy for the Council here, having developed its DS3 and DS4 scenarios, and then to find in due course that it can't address the queues and the queuing traffic in the way that it had hoped to do there at Wacombe and Robin Hood, because those controlling the land in question indicated there's absolutely no way that they would release the land in order to improve the operation of the junctions. So that is nonetheless where we are. The question and issue, it seems to us, that arises for the Council and for you, ma'am, is really whether there is a need to introduce legal restrictions on the type and the number, and therefore the number of vehicles travelling on the roads through Epping Forest, be that by means of a speed limit, as has been suggested, an HGV ban on certain roads, or a low emission zone. That is what you and the Council need to reflect on, it seems to us, in order to, if you're considering now whether an additional level of certainty needs to be delivered to the judgments that have to be made. And of course, I close with the thought that, of course, there are judgments that need to be made here. We are looking ahead to the future. Yes, in an ideal world, everything could be scientifically proven, but that isn't realistic, and we have to apply our professional judgment in the best possible way in order to reach a sound outcome so far as this plan is concerned. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Any last words from the Council? And did you want to say anything in relation to Mr. Pinnock's point about the different assumptions made? I think we heard a bit from Mr. Dagley. Did you want to comment on that now, or would you like to? I think it would be useful to do it now if it's in the context of the HRA. And then after that, we're going to stop on air quality and move on to recreation. Thank you.
Yes, Madam. I'd introduce you to Simon Jones, Mr. Jones, who's from Jacobs, who's been doing all the transport work for the Council on behalf of Essex Highways.
Thank you.
Yes, could I just be reminded the precise question? I think it was to compare the scenarios tested in the HRA and within the transport assessment report. Is that correct? The transport assessment report relies on peak hour assessments, whereas we had to develop a separate assessment for the air quality purposes within the SAC, which we agreed largely with the City of London Conservators and later with Natural England. There were two different modelling platforms. We couldn't develop a VISA model for the whole district because that would just be uneconomical, but for the purposes of the SAC, it gave the queue length, durations, queue lengths, journey times and speeds for feeding into the air quality modelling work. The scenarios we tested there were derived directly from Natural England, who advised on the cumulative impact of the HMA authorities, background growth as well from the London boroughs, which we later brought some of that into the transport assessment work, which went into the TAR. But for the purpose, the scenarios that we tested in the TAR were specifically focused at with and without development in a peak hour, whereas the HRA relies on average models to derive AADTs across a daily average, and the factors that go into that are slightly different. Does that allow provide an answer to the question?
Well, I think by the sound of it, they're different. One's got daily averages, the other one's got peak outflows.
Yep.
If there are sort of material other differences, it'd be helpful to know what they are before Thursday. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that. So we'll move on now to recreational activity. Now, maybe just because it's at this time of in the afternoon, I'm not going to depart from my agenda quite so significantly. In here, I don't think there's quite so much that came up out of the new information that would necessitate that. But again, I'm mindful of the need to sort of be flexible about it. And I've put out some areas here that I'm concerned to cover. But again, I don't want to, as we have the experts in the room, I don't want to miss miss the key points. So if they're not as I've got them written down, then please go ahead. As I said at the beginning, I'm not going to deal with the first 2 bullet points that I have on the agenda under item 2. So we'll move straight on to the Epping Forest. So again, I think if I just summarise, I think it can be a bit simpler about it perhaps than it's set on the agenda. I'd quite like if I start with the council, and then again we'll go around the table. If you could just explain the findings of the assessment, if you like, in relation to this matter, and what the relevance of the 3 kilometre and 6.2 kilometres zone of influence are, and then essentially what the plan proposes to do within those distances. And indeed, I suppose I'm not particularly clear on what's intended to happen between 0 and 3 kilometres. That's perhaps not as clear as it is between 3 and 6.2. So just exactly what's the issue with recreational impact? What does the plan propose to do about it within the different zones identified? And is all of that justified, and is it reflected within the plan? Obviously, issues have been raised over the certainty and what's actually going to be done to achieve any SANGs proposed. So I think if you can just sort of broadly cover those issues, and then I'm sure something more detailed will come out of it. I have asked a specific question about Jessel Green and the Limes estate. And whether the HRA supports the allocation of those sites. And I don't think that there was anything particularly sort of clear in the response of certainly Natural England's response either way on that. So if you can shed any light on those 2 particular sites, for anyone who's not know them terribly well, they're obviously there's green spaces within built up areas that are proposed to be partly developed. And it's come up as a concern. So if we could just sort of take us through it really on those terms, that would be helpful. So if we begin with Mr. Riley or the council, Ms. Cooper, thank you.
Thank you, Madam. If I start by explaining the zone of influence of 6.2 kilometres, that was identified from a visitor's study, which I think Dr. Dagley referred to early, which was undertaken on behalf of a number of authorities, including the London boroughs of Waltham Forest and Redbridge and the Schmar authorities. To understand, it was undertaken, I think, in October 2017, to understand the visitors and where they came from. And that survey found that 75%, or the 75th percentile of visitors, came within a 6.2 kilometre radius. As you've heard, we are about to embark on another visitor survey because it was felt that the timing of that in October and November meant that it perhaps didn't accurately represent summer visitors, if I put it that way, to the visit to the forest. as a result, obviously, of the zone of influence affects the visitors, additional homes built within the zone of influence, when taken in combination with other plans and projects, have the potential to increase pressure on the special area of conservation and a likely significant effect. There's no way of preventing more people who come to live in the zone of influence as a result of new development from visiting the forest in order to avoid placing further pressure on it. And therefore, as you've heard, there's a need to undertake measures to mitigate those likely significant effects. So we took a report to Cabinet, which I've alluded to before, on the 18th of October 2018, which set out an interim approach to managing the recreational pressures on Epping Forest. And that was developed in conjunction with the Conservators, who developed a series of measures to mitigate the impact of visitors to the forest. And the measures they sought total about 1.3 million during the plan period up to 31st of March 2033. The view taken by this authority, and obviously it's up to the other competent authorities to decide how they are going to levy the money. Obviously, one way to levy the money is through Section 106 contributions. Others might be for the council to pay the sum itself without levying it off specific development. But the view taken by this authority was that we should seek a contribution from individual residential development schemes within 0.3 kilometres of the boundary, because that's where most of the pressure arose from and where a large quantum of the development was coming from. In relation to, so the 3 kilometre distance reflects the fact that 93% of all visitors with the entire zone of influence live within 3 kilometres of the forest. And that's where the frequency of visits comes from. And the number of visitors from between 3 and 6.2 kilometres was on a less frequent basis. But obviously we recognise that the zone of influence may change as a result of the further visitor survey work that will be done. When we come to looking at the policy later, we're trying to take a flexible approach so that if the visitor survey shows that the zone of influence is different, the council may choose to collect contributions from a different circumference, should we put it that way. So if you look at the report that went to Cabinet, it sets out within there the interim approach some very detailed measures which are put in place, and including monitoring, including payments towards taking additional visitor surveys in the future. So although we're committed to doing one now, we will obviously be monitoring and doing further ones in the future to check what's happening, and obviously to make sure that the measures that are being put in place are achieving what they're intended to do. So that's all I was going to say around that, unless you want me to say anything further about that. We are developing, in relation to SANGS, we are developing a SANGS strategy. As you've heard, some of the strategic sites, particularly the garden community sites, there is provision for SANGS within those sites. We are intending to write out to all developers about further SANGS and SANGS strategy. That's been slightly delayed by the fact that we're trying to cooperate with our neighbouring authorities in relation to information that's just been sent out, and I think was referred to by Telelands earlier, the letter from Natural England about Hatfield Forest and the SSSI, which of course is not caught by the habitat regs, but obviously they are looking at mitigating visitor pressure. So we're trying to have a coordinated approach to developing a SANG strategy with our neighbours to ensure that we mitigate that. We do believe that we will be mitigating through the provision of SANGs within this district. In relation to Epping Forest, we'll also take any pressure that may be perceived on Hatfield Forest too. So we believe that we've got the hooks within the plan and the policy requirements to secure SANGs through policy DM2 and policy SP5, and also in relation to the specific policies in Epping and North Wales Bassett. All of those sites are required to develop master plans which will need to demonstrate a meaningful proportion of natural green spaces being provided. And obviously the adequacy of the quantum and design of those spaces to act as SANGs will be the subject of further detailed discussions with Natural England. That relates to sites of over 400 dwellings within 3 to 6.2 kilometres of the SAC. Sites of 100 or more homes are required to provide on-site open space provision in accordance with Policy DM6 Part A, and also where indicated in Chapter 5 and Appendix 6 of the local plan submission version. The specific mechanisms for delivery of any off-site SANGs will be identified through the final mitigation strategy. The strategy that we've been discussing that went in October was necessarily an interim mitigation strategy. We have already achieved some contributions, although it must be appreciated that this district currently has a moratorium. We're not able to issue any planning permissions because of the issues relating to air quality and the fact that the Habitat Regs assessment has not been signed off, as it were, by Natural England. So we're in a very serious situation in this district in not being able to issue any planning permissions. So necessarily that has affected the contributions that we've been able to collect to deal with the recreational pressure, because a lot of those applications are being held in abeyance pending the outcome of the HRA.
Thank you. If I can just seek perhaps a couple of points of clarification before we move around the table. So the intended approach to deal with the likely significant effects within the 6.2 kilometre zone of influence is you're seeking contributions from developments within 0.3 kilometre, within 0 to 3 kilometres of the boundary, because that's where most of the visitors come from. Is that all scales? Is that all scales of development? Or?
Yes, it's down to a single dwelling, and the cost of per dwelling at the moment to meet our contribution towards the projects that have been identified by the Conservators is £352 per dwelling.
Okay.
I should say that's net additional dwellings. So if there's a conversion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just to then clarify the circumstances in which you think SANGs are required. Can you just be very clear about the circumstances in which SANGs are required?
Yeah, we're talking about sites which are delivering over 400 homes within 3 to 6.2 kilometres of the forest.
To provide them on site, is that?
To provide, and this is where we're still developing, but either to provide on site or to make contributions towards off-site SANGs. And as I've already indicated, we've already got Latin Priory proposal for a SANG there, and we're talking around the master plans for the South Epping and for North Wales Bassett about the provision of SANGs in those master plan areas.
Do you have a list to hand of which sites that applies to, or is it that would be easy to come by? Would it be easy to produce? I'm going to ask you in a minute. It's probably back to front. I wonder what the justification for the 400 homes is, first of all. But then, if that's what you feel is required, is it possible to, if you haven't already got it somewhere in the evidence, to provide a list of the allocated sites that would apply to, and whether they are going to provide their own SANG or whether they're going to contribute to an off-site SANG?
we can certainly provide a list, and I think it would be better to do that rather than me do it off the cuff.
Yeah, okay, so we'll have a list of the relevant sites.
Yeah.
And whether on-site
Or off-site.
or off-site.
Yeah.
And what is the justification for the 400 threshold?
A reasonable quantum of development to provide a meaningful SANG. I think that we've probably discussed before, in order to cater for dog walkers, they have to be a minimum size of something, I think it's 40 hectares in size, and therefore it's not appropriate to try and provide those on much smaller sites. It's better to have that quantum of open space to provide a suitable route for dog walkers, and to provide several larger ones rather than lots of little ones. There is, of course, a requirement for open space provision on all large schemes, and even smaller schemes, of either on a private or public open space. And specifically sites of 100 plus homes are required to provide on-site open space, but they wouldn't function as a SANG because of their size.
Okay, and then coming back just to a moment ago, I asked about the list of sites within 3 to 6. Are there any 400 plus sites within 3 kilometres? 400 plus sites, sorry.
I'll have to come back to you on that.
Because if there are, I wonder why they don't have to also provide a SANG. They'd only have to provide a contribution.
Sorry, I'll just provide an explanation there. It's partly because within the 3 kilometre zone, a lot of the sites are you're in highly urban areas. You have large settlements there, so there is lesser opportunity to provide on-site SANG. It's also partly a function of the fact that, as was alluded to earlier by Dr. Dagley at the beginning, Epping Forest is a large, very attractive site. It has a distinct appeal of its own, and when you're talking about new development that's located on its doorstep, if you like, drawing visitors away onto a SANG rather than targeting how they use the SAC is perhaps potentially less effective. So the idea is that within the 3 kilometre zone, at least before the first plan review period, there would be a focus there on the on-site mitigation measures, access management, management of urbanisation impacts, fly tipping, etc., providing that assistance along the measures that were outlined by the conservators, with a view taken after that as to whether or not SANG would be feasible. If they're feasible, then they would be added to the package. But SANG are hugely expensive to deliver and maintain, and we don't want to do it where there isn't a high level of confidence it would be effective. And when we're very close to the SAC, we are slightly concerned that it may not be adequate. Whereas within the 6.2 kilometre zone, for example, 3 sites, SP 5.1, SP 5.2 and NWB R.3, so that is North Weald, Bassett, sorry, I've lost the numbers now. Yes, North Weald, Bassett, the Water Lane area and Latin Priory, they're responsible between them for about 70% of all new houses within the 6.2 kilometre zone. So you're not only having the mass of you've got a large site that can support a very large SANG, you're also, a small number of sites can capture a large number of the additional residents in that area.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. That's all helpful. But I guess what I was after with that list of sites, if it isn't only, because I think I've put in the agenda, does it apply only to SP 5.1, 5.2, Epping R1, R2, and North Weald, Bassett R3? If it does, then maybe the question's simple: are all of those able to provide SANGs? The question remains the same. So for the sites to which that applies, for the sites to which the requirement for an on-site or contribution to an off-site SANG applies, where are you with that? I mean, in terms of, is it in the policy? Is it in the policy? Are the proposals able to demonstrate that they can provide a SANG? If they can't and they're going to contribute to an off-site SANG, then what is the confidence that the council has that land can be found in the right place at the right time, as we stand at the moment? Now, I don't know whether that's the question I need an answer to, I think. I don't know whether you can provide that answer now, or some of the answer now, or whether you need to come back on that.
I think I can provide part of the answer now in that,
Thank you.
as far as we're aware, or I'm aware at the moment, it only provides to the sites SP 5.1, 5.2, EPPR 1, EPPR 2, and NWBR 3. We are certainly in discussions around Water Lane, Latham Priory, and North Weald Bassett about on-site SANG. And there is certainly provision within EPPR for open space provision. Whether it is going to be large enough to be counted as a SANG, I need to double check, I think. But as I say, we are also in discussions about a wider strategy for SANGs and off-site contributions. I think because they're in master plan areas, all of those that I've identified, we have got sufficient within the policy.
Just remind me how many dwellings are proposed on Jessel Green? Okay.
It was 154.
54. Okay. So you're pretty certain that the only plus 400 that would be required to provide their own SANG are those 4 sites listed?
Yes.
And the only one where there's perhaps doubt at the moment that couldn't provide that is the Epping site. So that's the site that potentially the requirement for a contribution to an off-site SANG would apply to.
Yes.
Thank you.
But that is subject to the discussions with Natural England about the quantum and design and whether or not it would count as a SANG or not, as I said earlier. And we're still having that conversation about the final approach.
Okay, thank you. And then before going around the table, the other thing that would help me with a bit more explanation is this moratorium on the current situation. You talk about that can't be lifted until the HRA is signed off. We've obviously heard concerns about the HRA. How is that going to be signed off? Are you essentially waiting for me to say that it's okay, or is there a different process? Where do we stand with that at the moment?
Well, I suppose we had, because we've been working with Natural England all along and we thought we had an agreed methodology, it came as a bit of a surprise to us, to put it bluntly, on the 25th of April when Natural England submitted their hearing statement that they weren't happy with the approach that was being taken. We're conscious that we need to have an air quality strategy in place, and I've outlined to you already that we've taken a report to Cabinet and we have a draft air quality strategy. We need Natural England to be confident that that is going to deliver in order for them to effectively say to us that we can now issue planning permission for new development, and it's not just residential development, it's employment as well within the district, which is subject to an HRA.
Okay, well, perhaps Natural England can say a bit more about that. Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful to me. I wanted to hear the council's position as to where we are at the moment. Perhaps if I can then hear the contrary views, if they are contrary.
Just to take the point about moratorium first of all, the local authority is the planning authority. We're not the planning authority. It's for the competent authority to decide as and when planning applications are made, whether or not, first of all, they need to be screened in, as it were, for an appropriate assessment, and then on the basis of that assessment for that particular project, whether or not it can be permitted under the Habitats Directive and regulations. Natural England haven't and can't impose a moratorium on development. All we do is we're consulted on planning applications and we express our view. whether or not we believe that there is sufficient certainty or not in respect of any particular planning application, and we'll do that on a case-by-case basis. But at the end of the day, it is for the local authority to decide whether there is sufficient certainty or not in respect of any particular scheme and what harms it may cause to the site. So if the authority isn't satisfied in respect of individual applications it's currently considering, query, how can it be satisfied with the HRA that it's produced today? If it is satisfied, then that's a matter for Epping Forest to grant planning permission, but we're not imposing a moratorium as such. All we're doing is we're expressing a view as and when we're consulted based on the evidence that we have before us. Now, in respect of what we were talking about, the recreational disturbance, Natural England's view and approach has been, not just on this site, that the preferred approach is an avoidance approach where you are looking to divert people from accessing the protected site in the first place. So that's the logic behind SANG. It's alternative green space. Some of the people who may use new alternative space will be existing residents, and some will be new residents, depending on where it is. But overall, the point of it is that you're avoiding additional visits to the protected site. Now, what we haven't got at the moment, and what Natural England has said is, we haven't got a strategy before us where it said, okay, this amount of alternative space is going to be provided, it's going to be provided on these sites, and this is roughly the intended design of it. And then we can express a view. Do we think that that will divert sufficient numbers of people, it will work? But we don't have that. We've got a concern as well about this issue about sites smaller than 400. Now, just to be clear, SANG needs to be a certain size to work, that's clear. It's got to, for instance, cater for dog walkers and so on. So we clearly can't expect every small site that comes forward to provide on-site SANG. However, it's clearly preferable, if we're going to rely on SANG as our primary means of effect avoidance, that they will have to provide for or not, but there'll have to be some alternative for the residents to use, whether it's a local park or whatever it may be. Now, what we don't have for the allocations and windfalls that are planned for that won't provide for on-site SANG is a strategy for where the new strategic SANG will go in terms of, is the land available, how much will be provided, and how does that relate to the number of people who are supposed to use it and where they're going to be. Because we don't have that, Natural England is in a position where it can't conclude that, with certainty that all of that strategy is going to avoid the impacts from the recreational activities. So that's where we are on that. We can give some sort of indicative guidance, and there is indicative guidance published by Natural England about the sort of quantums per 1,000 population and so on. But obviously it depends on the particular circumstances whether or not you could deviate from those general guidelines. You could improve existing parks and so on, but one needs to have a strategy that one can then advise on. So that's where we are with that.
Sorry to butt in. So
yeah.
just to stop you there, are you? What we've heard from the council is that sites of 100 plus houses, actually nothing below 100 perhaps, but sites of 100 plus houses should provide on-site open space. Are you concerned that won't be? Are you concerned that won't be adequate, or are you concerned about the missing sites, if you like, beneath the 100 houses, or is it two separate issues?
To different extents, both. But of course, it does depend on what is proposed where. But in principle, obviously the ideal, you've got a mitigation hierarchy. So the ideal is that you avoid any effects because everybody has an alternative site. Now we know that some people will want to recreate in the forest. So that's why if you can capture sufficient existing residents, divert those as well with the on-use SANG, then you don't have to worry about the small number of residual additional residents. Because we haven't got the detail, we're not in a position really to estimate what proportions of additional residents, and of course what we're really interested in is how many additional visits and where are they going to go on the site, to weigh up whether we can rule out a significant impact on the integrity of the site. So, but clearly, the access management measures, there's more than one way to skin the cat. We could, if, in theory, completely exclude any visits from the forest. You could fence off the forest. That would also do the same thing as diverting, but obviously we're not proposing to do that. So there is a balance between access management and avoidance as possible strategies. The access management, we've seen an interim approach. All of those measures are welcome, but in and of themselves, you can't draw a direct link and say, well, these will prevent a certain number of people from doing a certain number of things, because it's in the nature of those that you can't really quantify those. So, I mean, at the moment, the interim ones that we've got are possible traffic control, which again, because it's not specified yet what exactly that will be, we can't quantify it. We've got employment of additional people to help to go out on site and engage with people, improvement of tracks and paths and so on. So they're all welcome things. It's hard to quantify, so that they are very much seen as a sort of fallback to mop up any residue. That's always been Natural England's approach. It's to provide an additional confidence that if there are people who aren't being intercepted by SANG, that there won't be significant impact. So in the absence of a SANG strategy being set out, it becomes much harder to rely on the SAMs alone. Now, in terms of the funding or which radius is required to contribute to what, Natural England's entirely agnostic about that. As long as we identify what's required and it's provided, Natural England doesn't have a position on who should be paying for it. So, in a sense, we're agnostic about the mechanics of who's required to pay towards what, as long as we identify what's needed and it's provided.
Just come back on a couple of points. Just want to make it absolutely clear that the moratorium is in relation to air quality issues, not on recreational impact issues. The interim mitigation strategy and the package of measures and projects was developed by the Conservatives in conjunction with Natural England. Natural England signed that off as an acceptable package to deal with access management.
The interim strategy.
The interim strategy and the measures and projects that were developed with the Conservatives. We're reliant on the Conservatives to implement those projects. The forest is managed by the Conservatives on behalf of the City of London Corporation. It's a public body. And they are the ones who will be implementing those projects. So we are collecting the resource, if you like, for them to be able to deliver those projects.
But is the interim strategy intended to deal with the problems that exist at the moment, or is that intended to mitigate growth?
It's to mitigate right up to 2033, as I outlined initially. The projects are set up. We will obviously be continuing to monitor and review the plan over the course of the plan period, or the mitigation strategy over the course of the plan period, and I've already indicated we'll be doing updated visitor surveys to check where visitors are coming from and whether or not additional measures are required over the plan period. But essentially, it is for the lifetime of the plan. The cost of the projects is some 1.3 million of the cost of the plan. We have allocated the per dwelling quantum on the basis of the total amount of development that's coming forward through the plan.
And so that doesn't cover the SANG strategy, is that
no,
right?
The SANG
so
strategy.
How do the two relate? Is the interim strategy for access mitigate is that access management is that insufficient without the SANG strategy?
Well, I think as I've tried to explain, the interim, but that's the reason why we're collecting, or part of the reason for collecting within 0.3 kilometres for development to contribute towards the interim mitigation strategy. And for developments outside between 3 and 6.2 kilometres, we're developing a SANG strategy, and on the sites that we've already discussed and identified.
So the two together?
The two together, it's a combination of the two. And as I said, we're still developing exactly what that will look like with Natural England. So if an application for 400 homes came up now, we would be looking to either a SANG within the site or a off-site contribution towards a SANG.
Okay, so is that a point of difference, or am I misunderstanding between Natural England and the council that is your position that SANG, be it on-site or off-site, is only required to support development of the plus 400 homes?
Yes, madam.
Yes, but I don't know, again, unless I'm misunderstanding, I think the point I was hearing over here is that SANG is actually necessary, strategic SANG is necessary for every development to divert people away from the forest, accepting that it can't be provided on site, not just the plus 400 homes.
I'm going to pass over to Ms Fraser in a second, but I think the answer is yes, but it may not literally be for every single house. But overall, one has to ask, does this plan mitigate itself effectively? So particularly, obviously, the closer you get to the forest, other things being equal, the more you would expect any new residents to use the forest. But you will have to look at all the measures as a whole and decide, are the existing green spaces, the new green spaces, etc., going to do enough in conjunction with those access measures so that you can be certain that there won't be an adverse impact from recreation in combination with air pollution and the other aspects. I'm going to pass over to Ms Fraser and see if she's got anything else to add.
Thank you. Sorry, just to be really clear about what I'm asking, because I'm not meaning to be awkward. I'm trying to understand. So I think the council's position is that with the interim mitigation strategy that it's already got, plus SANGs for plus 400 dwellings within the 3 to 6 kilometres, that should provide adequate mitigation. And then my question is, does Natural England agree with that point? Or from what I've heard what I've heard already, there's a question in my mind as to whether Natural England thinks that you need the interim mitigation strategy, which is the access management, plus the SANGs for the 400 plus dwellings, plus some other strategic SANG for what?
Yes, so that is what we're saying.
Okay.
We don't have a precise answer to this because it's inherently, you've got to look at everything in the round and reach a judgment. But you need to know what SANG is being proposed and then assess, is there likely to be a shortfall? And you've got to then look at, well, who's going to be using, which of the additional residents that we're planning for are likely to use the forest, and what other diversion of them or existing people is being planned. And then you've got, if there is going to be a residue, one has to make some assessment as to how large that's likely to be. And are the SAMs, the on-site mitigation, are they likely to address it? So, in principle, you need some means of mitigating for all the new inhabitants. But how that's done, there isn't a single one-size-fits-all answer to that. But we don't have a strategy at the moment, so it's very difficult for us to say.
But in your view, the interim mitigation strategy, which is the access management, isn't sufficient alone? Okay, thank you.
Madam, if I may, and that's why it's an interim mitigation strategy, because we're yet to provide a final strategy which will be a combination of the access management strategy, which is set out in the interim strategy, together with the SANG strategy. And that will consist of the final. And that approach, we think, is achievable, and is an approach which has been taken elsewhere, including in relation to the Thames Basin, Heath's SPA.
Sorry, I think that there's
Yep.
just...
But
if I
is
could
there a
just-
difference over what that SANG strategy should be? Are you accepting that the final strategy, including the access management interim strategy, plus the SANG strategy, will include a strategic SANG to deal with development that doesn't fall within that plus 400 dwellings within 3 to 6 kilometre zone?
Well, we think the provision of SANGs on some of the master plan area sites will also take pressure off existing sites, such as the forest, but also other triple SIs.
Okay, and from what I've heard, potentially that could be the case, but Natural England, I guess, would say at this point that they don't know that yet. Okay. Thank you. Ms Hoskin, then Mr Altras and Mr Pinnock.
Thank you, Madam. I'd first like to make some overarching points and then maybe refer back specifically to the questions you've asked on the agenda, if that's okay.
Would you put your microphone a bit closer? Thank you.
Yeah, is that better?
Yep,
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'll lurch forward as well. I think it's really important to say at the start that developing a strategic mitigation scheme for recreation is complex, it's not easy, and thus far, as far as we've got, the Conservators have worked positively with the District Council to get as far as we have so far, and that's not in question. The problem is the timing and the fact that at the moment we've got one part of an overall mitigation strategy. There's been a lot of good work on the on-site access management measures, and that is in part due to the efforts that the Conservatives have put in working with the council. But importantly, the on-site access management measures must work together with the off-site provision, with the SANGs provision. And the two are not separate. They are very much integrated. And when you're developing a mitigation strategy for recreation, you need to look at the local situation to decide what the relative contributions of the two are in order to be confident that you've got a good, robust mitigation package. So at the moment, we haven't got the SANGs element of the overall strategy developed, and that makes it very difficult because the SANGs element needs to be plan-led. Incredibly difficult to retrofit the SANGs element at the project level. Having said that, we recognise that there has been the start of some initial thinking around the SANGs strategy, and the Council is committed to preparing that. And again, it's about timing. We haven't got that, so we haven't yet got the certainty. And just sort of moving towards the types of things you might think about in a SANGs strategy, you might need to think about the housing locations for the allocations in relation to Epping Forest, where the best places would be to provide a diversion, looking at the monitoring that's taken place elsewhere on other European site strategic mitigation schemes. What are they saying currently? Obviously, you're looking at your visitor behaviour. You're looking at how people might get to and from Epping Forest, and how people might get to alternative sites. And SANGs themselves can be provided individually by a developer. They can also be provided by a consortium of developers. They could be provided by a third party. They could indeed be provided by the planning authority themselves. And all these things are normally considered in a SANG strategy. At the moment, we've got a commitment for 4 allocations, because there are over 400 dwellings, to provide a SANG, and the explanation given as to why the 400 was chosen was that they can provide a reasonable size of SANG, and that it needs to be of a certain size to function. That's true, but they're only going to provide the mitigation for those 4 developments, unless those SANGs are actually even bigger and therefore providing more of a strategic role. So those are the kind of things that are yet to be thought through. In terms of the specific 4 allocations, we're aware that some very positive work has been going on in terms of Latin Priory, for example. And there has been some initial discussions possibly on the other sites, but in our view, we're not seeing anything that gives us certainty that SANGs can be delivered on those allocations yet. And that comes back to my point about a plan-led approach. If you've not got certainty, it's incredibly difficult to try and do that at the project level. Another point is that's really important for the SANG strategy is getting the timing right. So getting the right SANGs coming forward in time with the housing coming forward. So going back to your questions on your agenda, does the interim strategy, which is primarily, well, entirely on-site focused, avoid adverse effects? Then no, because it's only one part of the overall strategy required. And we're yet to think about the SANG strategy, and we're also yet to think about how the 2 parts of the strategy work together. Mr. Riley alluded to the point that those developments in close proximity are less likely to use an alternative green space. Well, that's a really important point that highlights the fact that the 2 must work together, and you've got to think about the 2 together. I'd just like to make one more point about the 100 house thing. The policy referred to with the 100 house threshold, that's an open space threshold. And it's important to point out that meeting the minimum standards for open space is not the same as providing an effective SANG. They're for different purposes. Obviously, they're related. And in some circumstances, you can layer up the 2. A SANG can also meet open space revision, but there are specific and additional criteria, of which size is only one, that need to be met in order for a site to be a SANG. And so my conclusion would be, going back to Dr. Chapman's point about have we got confidence that we can remove reasonable scientific doubt? I don't think we have now, but we are partway through a process where we're trying very hard to make sure we have got that, but at this point in time we haven't.
So again, being as pragmatic as you can be without straying into accepting things where reasonable scientific doubt remains, what do you think needs to be done, putting aside air quality for now, on a recreational point of view? What do you think needs to be done in order for this plan to be adopted? Does all of this information need to be, and all of the proposals need to be provided up front and now and be in the plan before the plan can be adopted? Or are there any sort of safeguards that can be, do we have sufficient confidence that the plan provides an appropriate framework for these measures to be achieved, such that a safeguard could be put in somehow to sort of prevent development happening in the event that it didn't come forward as expected? Or, with those sort of questions in mind, what could be done? Is there anything that can be done now to enable the plan to be adopted before all of this work is completed?
I forgot to put it back on. I do believe that progression of the SANG strategy is critical, because provision of SANGs has got to be plan-led, as I said before, otherwise it's incredibly difficult. So I think that the two things, progressing the SANGs part of the overall strategy and making sure that the SANG strategy and the SAM strategy, the two parts, work together effectively, I think that they are essential.
And just perhaps quickly, the same question of Natural England before I come to Mr. Altras.
Well, I think that is right. I think we would endorse the comments that have been made. In principle, you could have potentially a less developed SANG strategy, but you need to cater for sort of an interim, perhaps first 5 years or something like that, if you were minded to go down that route. But if we couldn't get all the strategic sites together, potentially, if the geography allowed, you could have some of it and then either a review or to link different elements together. But the problem is, we haven't even got that level of strategy here. So we can't really, it's difficult to speculate, but we need something concrete that you can look at and take a view, will it mitigate itself effectively?
Mr. Altras.
Thank you, Madam. Madam, within 3 kilometres of the SAC, the recreational urbanisation impact is positively identified, and you will find the reference for your notes is paragraph 519 of the HRA. Now, how is that impact going to be prevented? And it's a serious impact, as I understand it. It is said that it will be prevented by the measures set out first in the interim mitigation strategy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And second, something which I think I've only heard for the first time, I may have missed it in the plan itself, but I heard for the first time a few minutes ago, which was that developments involving dwellings of over 100 houses will need to provide either, whether you call it open space or their own SANGs, I am not too clear. But as I say, I don't think you can find this in the plan itself, as far as I know. That is, of course, I should be subject to correction, because I don't know this plan backwards and forwards, but as far as I know, that is the position. Going back then to the interim mitigation strategy, the importance of this document is that it is the only mitigation strategy before you at the moment, and it is the one upon which you must base your judgment as to whether the plan will cause real damage to the SAC. Now, it is said that there will subsequently be a final mitigation strategy. That is not before you at the moment. You are not able, in our submission, to rely upon some future mitigation framework, the contents of which are presently uncertain and unknown. The precautionary principle requires that the competent authority, you, Madam, should refuse to approve the proposed plan where you are not yet certain that it will not adversely affect the integrity of the site at issue. Now, may I then go back to the question of the interim mitigation strategy, and I'm making a number of submissions. First, of course, this is only an interim strategy. It's not a final strategy, that's self-evident. Second, there is no evidence before you that the measures set out in the interim strategy would avoid or significantly reduce the effects of the plan on the integrity of the SAC. Third, paragraph 18 of the interim strategy itself claims as follows: there is no way of preventing more people who come to live in the zone of influence as a result of new residential development from visiting the forest, forgive me, in order to avoid placing further pressures upon it? Yes, there is. There is a way, and that is to avoid new residential development within that 3 kilometres, and in particular, and this is particularly true, of Jessel Green. As you know, the HRA is somewhat equivocal as to whether or not it's appropriate to include Jessel Green in the plan as a residential development. I notice, and it's maybe a bad point to take, but I notice you specifically put that point to the council, but the council did not choose to address themselves to it. The fact is, Madam, as you will see from paragraph 530 of the HRA, that Jessel Green and one other site are specifically called out as being sites in which open land, which is heavily used, is being taken away for residential development within the 3 kilometre area. It is, in our submission, a bizarre exercise of future planning to require the provision of, whether you call it open space or SANGs, while at the same time allocating for development well-used and well-established open space at Jessel Green. And in our submission, that really cannot stand that particular allocation. That then leads me to the next point. It is said by Natural England, and I think also by the city, that the interim mitigation strategy can't stand on its own, that it has to have with it some sort of SANG strategy, which we don't have, and or the provision of a policy whereby development of a certain size within that 3 kilometre zone provides additional open space so as to deflect future residents from going to the forest. And it's only those two things that, acting in tandem, according to Natural England and the city, that will work. As I say, there is no provision, as I can see it in the plan, for additional open space to be provided for those developments within the 3 kilometre zone that are going to provide for residential, for dwellings of 100 houses or more. It is said in the amended, the suggested amendments to DM2 that there will be a recreational pressures mitigation framework. Now, I have no idea what this is going to contain, and I don't suppose you do either. But unless it's before you, before the end of the inquiry, that's not something that you are going to be able to rely upon. Nor will you be able to rely upon a green infrastructure strategy unless it's before you by the end of the inquiry. Turning to the interim mitigating measures themselves, first of all, Strand 1A speaks of road closures. This is the most expensive element of the interim mitigating measures. Which roads, we ask rhetorically, which roads are going to be closed and when? There's a suggestion that certain car parks can be improved, whether by charging for them or by tarmacking the surface, I'm not sure. But again, one asks oneself, which car parks and when? And how are you to form a judgment that this interim mitigation strategy will work without knowing those sort of details? And the same questions arise as regards the proposed realigned and new paths and walks through the forest. So far as mitigating measures Strand 1B is concerned, there is to be apparently a mitigation strategy development officer, and he or she is going to produce strategy for visitors sometime in the future, and no clarity as to what that strategy is or is likely to be. And as to mitigating measures strand 2, that is simply evidence gathering and not mitigation in itself. So, Madam, we submit that you are left in this position, that as regards the impact of increased recreational and urbanisation on the SAC, you are simply left with a dearth of evidence that there are sufficient measures to ensure that there will be no material effect on the SAC.
Thank you, Mr. Altress. Mr. Pinnock.
Thank you, Ma'am. You won't be surprised that we concur with the view on the evidence base in respect of the confidence that you began this session in seeking in relation to effects. And you asked in particular, obviously, how the Council's belief translates into evidence to give confidence. And what we've heard is that it doesn't, because the measures are either unspecified or aspirational or still under development in a way which excludes them from any proper consideration, as has been said, as a matter of evidence. Just to give some examples of where the sort of development stage of that, and the Council described the current position as they're still developing what that, being the mitigation for this plan, will look like. When we're at examination in public of a plan in, relating to one of the most sensitive SACs of its kind, and we're still developing what the mitigation will look like. The scale of the challenge in terms of SANG provision in particular, and the reasons why it's so important in our submission, but also in the submission to the corporation as a plan-led exercise, it can be seen from the table that was submitted as part of our Matter 10 hearing statement. That's table 2.1, which applied the 8 hectares per 1,000 additional people that Natural England referred to, and in the letter that we handed in this morning. It's included in that Hatfield letter, which resulted, as that table shows, in a total requirement for SANG of about 170 hectares of land. Over 30%, 34% of which is outside those 4 main allocations. And there was a point of clarification that I thought I heard the Council say earlier on, that despite what's said in the interim mitigation strategy about the Epping South Master Plan, the 950 unit scheme, my understanding is that what's said in the interim strategy is that will be an on-site SANG, consuming the smoke of the 950 units, has already been said, not a strategic SANG, as the point that was made earlier by the corporation. But I thought I heard the Council say that, well, through some of these discussions which are now, during this local plan examination taking place, on feasibility, that would go off-site and be perhaps dealt with by contribution. So I wanted to, well, just raise that as a point of uncertainty. Maybe that I've missed the point there. And then 3 more points, if I may. We've already heard that obviously there isn't a SANG strategy on which to comment in terms of feasibility, availability, whether it's the most appropriate strategy, what the end position will be in terms of reasonable scientific doubt. We've heard from the scientists that there are significant grounds for doubt to be had. And the Cabinet report to which you were referred, ma'am, which is EB 142A, is clear that in fact that strategy is only just beginning to be developed, and that the discussions which are now during this plan examination being had around feasibility are leading to changes. And if those changes, looking to the question you asked in terms of, well, what do we do about this, if those conversations had been had at the initial stage in terms of a proper analysis of alternatives, then the SANG opportunities, which are the best opportunities, which most reduce impacts on the SAC, which allow proper certainty about impacts, and which allow the MPPF requirement of soundness in relation to a justified plan which delivers the most appropriate strategy. Those questions could be answered by you in the context of this examination, but they can't. The only other point I wanted to raise is in relation to the interim mitigation strategy. Obviously, it envisages that, or it notes that something like 47% of SAC users, if you like, are from London boroughs of Redbridge and Waltham Forest. And we have, as you know, Ma'am, in correspondence in relation to the duty to cooperate, raised concerns about the frailties, inadequacies of that approach and the void, if you like, in terms of practical engagement with, to some extent, or differing extents, both of those authorities. But the concerns that have already been outlined in relation to the SANG strategy are magnified when you then look in the context of our most recent letter. What we say is the continuing evidence of a failure in the duty to cooperate, because those two authorities and the way that they are stitched in to a SANG strategy that could be examined today, which it can't, is absolutely crucial. And the point's already been taken, so I won't go on about it, but the 100 units and and I share Mr. Alstros's view that we couldn't see where in the plan that 100-unit policy is applied, but in any event, it's public open space, which, as you know, serves an entirely separate purpose, where it may overlap with SANG, but there's no suggestion whatsoever that even if there is a policy in relation to that 100 units, a policy in the plan, not something in the interim mitigation strategy, that it would secure the same outcomes as SANG and could be tested in the same way for feasibility, tested for attractiveness. As we've heard, the SAC is so special, but it's also incredibly attractive as a resource. And so whatever is put in place as a strategic SANG, and what's been suggested by Natural England is that the on-site SANGs at the 4 master plan sites couldn't really perform the role of strategic SANGs, therefore that land has to be sourced from elsewhere. There's no evidence in this plan that the sourcing of that strategic SANG has been properly identified.
Thank you. Well, a couple of obvious points to come back to the council on. Mr. Hill, it would be useful to hear from Mr. Hill in relation to some work that is presently ongoing. I think it would be useful to hear about progress with this final mitigation strategy that's being made. But perhaps, Mr. Hill, you could just give us a bit of a practical flavour of what is going on.
Well, ma'am, I can certainly do that insofar as the Latin Priory strategic site is concerned. I'm afraid I can't speak for the other strategic sites that are part of the Garden Town Initiative. And I don't want to repeat what we've said in our hearing statement on this. Ma'am, I'm not sure whether you will have picked this up, but we did, when we submitted our original Matter 1 hearing statement back in January, deal with quite a lot of issue 5 points, and we haven't sought to repeat all those again. And I would invite you to look back to what we say under issue 5 in our original Matter 1 submission, when it was expected that we would deal with these issues earlier in the examination. So I just ask you to look back to those when you have a moment. We've indicated from long ago that we see an opportunity to deliver a strategic SANG at Latin Priory, and I know you will have seen when we considered the details of the allocation, the emerging master plan work that we've done, which indicates an opportunity there, by virtue of the very extensive landholding that my clients control, to deliver not only, as it were, an on-site SANG to meet the requirements arising from the Latin Priory allocation, but also an extensive area immediately adjoining the B1393 London Road, or Epping High Road, however one wants to describe it, which, of course, would be the main route by which recreational users from the northern part of the district would proceed towards Epping Forest. So we consider that that land is very well placed indeed to divert recreational use from the north, which might otherwise proceed south towards Epping Forest. And if one were looking to locate a strategic SANG at a point where there was really the maximum opportunity to achieve that diversion, it would be in that general location. And we have, in our discussions with the council and with other parties around the table, been clear from an early stage that that opportunity is there to be pursued. And we certainly intend it to be part of our application when that's made. And I think that is, I think that accords with the reference that we heard a moment or two ago from the Conservators. The only other point I would want to make is that I noted there was a suggestion that SANG provision must be plan-led. I'm not sure in my experience that other inspectors examining plans of this nature have found it necessary to see, as it were, allocated strategic SANGs. Certainly they've needed to see that there is an evidence base that allows them to conclude that SANG issues have been considered. But I've not seen, in my experience, inspectors requiring that a full quantum, as it were, of SANG land is there allocated in the plan. And certainly that's my experience at Runnymede very recently, when the inspector simply asked for a list of the SANG options that were available to the council. Ma'am, I don't want to take any more time as it's 20 to 5. I hope that gives you a flavour of what it is that we have in mind and the proposals that we've been developing both in consultation with the council and other stakeholders.
Okay, again, I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to have we'll have a short break, but after which I do want to have just a brief opportunity to consider the two policies. But I'm hoping that can sort of draw together in a way some of the discussions we've had this morning, and certainly not repeat it. And take these two comments here, and then I did have a specific question, which I just wondered if we could address about, and it comes back to the sort of alternatives, what have you, raised by Mr. Pinnock. So I don't want a big discussion about alternatives again, because I have specifically asked whether there are settlements that wouldn't have wouldn't cause recreational pressure, and whether that's sort of simply anything outside of the zone. And if that's the case, how the council gave consideration to that. That would just be a useful way, I think, to perhaps round off the discussion. But if I just take Mr. Dagley, Ms. Hoskin for now.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to make 4 points. Partly picking up something that my colleague Ms. Hoskin said earlier, but also a point just raised by Mr. Hill. I think it reflects on the difficulty of project-led and a project-led approach. I think the work at Latin Priory clearly is very good. There's clearly a lot of potential there. But there are issues around that. One of them, as I understand it from when we discussed this before in the March hearings, is we did air this, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but Water Lane, as I understand it at the moment, which is to the west of Harlow and not far away from Latin Priory, doesn't have the space for SANGs. I mean, it obviously stand to be corrected if the council are moving on that. But one of the issues might be that if they are to use a strategic SANG at Latin Priory, is how they get there. It's not that far away, but the interception involves our land at Epping Long Green and also Harlow Woods Triple SI. The worry is whether the strategic SANG would actually work, or whether the pressure would simply, for Water Lane, if it doesn't provide its own SANG, or if there isn't a SANG strategy into which all these things can be fitted and worked out, then the default position might be for Water Lane simply to spill into our land and to Harlow Woods Triple SI. So I think just emphasise that kind of detail is why strategy is so important to be plan-led rather than project-led. Another one just related to that, which we discussed, but I didn't raise this point actually at the Places meeting, P1 for Epping. The Epping South R1 and R2 sites, they lie very close to our bufferlands, so not directly to the SAC, but to our bufferlands over a footbridge. I am concerned from the discussion that we had at the Places about the ability, and it's interesting also to hear that Ms. Blom-Cooper referred to this as well, about whether or not Epping South can really accommodate a high-quality SANG. It's got pylons, it's got the M25 motorway running alongside it. This issue of the difference between open space and quality SANGs is a key one. Now, if the people there don't have that space, in fact, allocation goes ahead, they have a number of footpaths, but one of them will be straight over a bridge onto our land at Great Gregory's. Now, we have elsewhere offered up bufferland as a possible SANG. We think it's a particular sort of super SANG approach, a real high-quality approach. But Gregory's is not one of those sites. It would be very vulnerable because it's got just footpaths and no public access because of our grazing it's our holding area for cattle and for young calves. So that's just an issue. There'll be a spillover. It's again just the issue about project-led rather than a bigger picture. That's point one. Point two, just want to touch on this balance between SANGs and SAMs. This also affects the London boroughs, which were mentioned just now, I think, and how they provide and fit into this, because they're also putting pressure on the SAC. And we're working hard at the moment to drill down and make our proposals in the mitigation strategy more robust, as I mentioned earlier today. But I think the key issue is about a joint SPD, that we need something that goes across plans that actually means people do know what's happening. So in addition to a strategic approach, I do think you need that wider approach. And that's something we've put in our letters in July, September, in a whole number of things. I just wanted to raise it very quickly. The other thing I'm slightly puzzled about, Mr. Riley quite rightly raised the issue about costs. SANGs do cost. They clearly need more than just a one-off payment. They need some building in of in perpetuity kind of management. And one of the ways of making sure that you build up enough money is not just to put the burden on a few sites. And at the moment, possibly only 2 of those 4 actually fit the bill, and we haven't heard much about Northfield Bassett yet. But is through a SANGs tariff and as separate from a SAMS tariff. Now, the interim strategy deals with the SAMS tariff, which Ms. Blom-Cooper's talked about, but we don't have a SANGs tariff, and yet other places like the Thames Basin, Heath and Surrey do have the 2 separated and quite clearly distinct, and they're not always charged to the same properties. And I think that's something we've been pushing for a while. I just wanted to repeat it now to make sure it isn't lost in the detail. Sorry, I should have said on the joint SPD, that's referred to in our Matter 16, paragraph 19, and on the Water Lane Epping sites I've just mentioned as point 1, that's under Matter 1, particularly our paragraphs 28 and 29 of our Matter 1 representation, and the balance between SAMs and SANGs we deal with to some degree in Matter 1, paragraph 20. And finally, the 4th point is about this issue also about it's about the types of visits. We're not trying to necessarily stop all visits to the forest. The forest will have a function. People, as we've talked before earlier this morning, you can't stop people doing stuff, and particularly in our situation, we can't. One of the key things that came out of the Hatfield study is the daily visits, how damaging they were to compaction of the soils, which we have similar clay soils here. It's that key thing. Again, a strategy needs to look at rather than a project-led approach, where you think, well, how are we going to deal with these different types of visits? Can we take, the forest, as we're doing through the SAMs, may take more irregular visits that people spend the day with their children and so on. But the daily, regular, twice a day, 3 times a day walk, that was what was so severely damaging to Hatfield. We can't control it in the way Hatfield were able to say to their own National Trust membership, please don't come in the winter. That's our option not open to us. So I think this is the whole point about a strategy, would address that kind of issue and that kind of quality or type of visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Toscan.
Thank you, Madam. I wanted to make one final point, which you may have already got, so please tell me if I don't need to go on. But it was about the 6.2 kilometre zone of influence. And I just wanted to raise that the Conservancy's statement has highlighted the confusion in the HRA between 3 kilometres and 6.2 kilometres. And I think that confusion primarily arises because we're only partway through the process of developing the overall strategy. And the 6.2 kilometres is a standard practice to identify the 75th percentile of visitors, and we draw that line as the zone of influence. The 3 kilometre boundary being used for the collection of tariffs for on-site mitigation is just a practical boundary. The origins of that lie in the District Council's consideration of how the visitor data relates specifically to them, but actually it's a practical boundary within which they are going to collect developer contributions for the on-site measures. But the point I want to make is that the on-site measures requirement and the SANGs off-site measure requirements apply to the whole zone of influence, and every net increase in housing needs to mitigate for its impact. And so the division of overall costs needs to be divided by the entirety of houses within the zone of influence. I think they may have got to that point with the on-site measures, but the burden of the costs is being borne within the 3 kilometres. But as I say, there's this confusion because we're only partway through the process. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying, but
Thank
I'm
you.
not sure that that's what you are actually collecting. So you're saying that they shouldn't be collecting towards it within just the 3 kilometres? It should be the 6.2.
I think, and that I'll let the council clarify, that they have divided the overall costs by the total number of houses in the 6.2. No, they've divided it by the number of houses in the 3. Okay, so thank you. So that leads on to the point I was making earlier about the SANGs and the SAM working together. We've got a zone of influence which requires mitigation, requires both SAM and SANG, and we need to make sure that full quantum of impact is being mitigated for. If the council have chosen to apply the tariff to mitigate just for those houses within 3 kilometres for the on-site measures, we're not having regard for the on-site need up to 6.2, and I agree that that is smaller than the 0 to 3. And the split of putting all the off-site into the 3 to 6 isn't accounting for those closer. And this is, we've not got to that point in developing the overall strategy of making the two mesh together and work properly together, and their relative contribution to the overall confidence that as a whole the package works.
Thank you. I'm going to take a last point from Mr. Hill and then come back to the council, and then we'll stop on this, have a short break and look at the policies briefly.
Ma'am, all I wanted to do, because I unfortunately can't stay after the break, was just deal with one loose end from this morning. I hope you will allow me to do this. You recall in relation to Appendix 1 to the extra paper that Natural England put in, the first thing I did this morning was just take you to the 1 kilometre squares, and we looked at the NOx concentrations at those 47 points. I did say that we'd only had that yesterday afternoon, and we were hoping to plot those points to show where the concentrations were. We've done that over the course of the day, and before I leave, I'll just circulate the results of that. The programme officer has it already. It's a simple sheet like that, which allows you to see the various kilometre squares, and there's a green code for anything less than 30 micrograms per cubic metre, and a red code for anything in excess of 30. So it just enables you to see at a glance the results of those 47 points. And as I say, ma'am, unfortunately, my clerks had optimistically scheduled a consultation for me at 6 o'clock in Chambers. I'm going to slip away and leave you in the capable hands of Mr. Roberts for the last session. But thank you.
Thank you for your contributions. Come back to the council. Firstly, on the progress with the mitigation strategy. I don't know if there's anything else you can contribute in relation to Mr. Hill's point about whether how far progressed that needs to be to give confidence for the plan, and then also perhaps if you could address the point made by Ms. Hoskin around the 3 or 6 kilometre zone for collecting contributions. That would be helpful, and then anything else you feel the need.
I'll try to be brief, given that we all want tea. Just dealing with the 3 kilometre and 6.2 kilometre distance, I think there's a bit of confusion here. We've chosen to collect the amount of money identified by the Conservatives in their projects and plans to mitigate access management in the forest. We have chosen to do that from developments within 3 kilometres of the forest as a result of the fact that 93% of the visitors to the forest come from those areas. We have taken the view that strategic SANG will mitigate and essentially consume their own smoke for developments between 3 and 6.2 kilometres. You've heard that quite a lot of our strategic sites, which will be master planned, are between 3 and 6.2 kilometres, including the site that Mr. Hill spoke to you about just now, where we are quite advanced in terms of master planning, but also the Water Lane area where we're also having discussions, and North Weald Bassett, where we're also having discussions about strategic SANG. So we've taken the view that those will mitigate the impact from those developments themselves, and in the case of Latin Priory, over and above. And that's the approach we've taken. As Natural England have already observed, it was down to the authority to determine how the monies are collected towards the projects identified by the Conservators. We've heard issues about the nature of those projects. Those projects were developed by the Conservators as their best response to deal with access management issues, and as I've said already, were agreed with Natural England, and they were agreed with Natural England even before we were able to see them ourselves. So I think that deals with that point. In relation to where we've said about open space provision, that's policy DM6 Part A. The SANG strategy is as I've described, is around bringing forward the strategic SANG, and is fairly well developed. What we haven't done is the quality and design of those SANGs, and agreed that with Natural England. So we would say it's fairly well advanced. We're keen to finalise a mitigation strategy, which, as I've said before, will consist of the air quality strategy and the recreational pressures strategy. We have, as I said previously, got a draft air quality strategy which we have shared on a confidential basis with Natural England for their informal comments. In terms of the point about at what stage in the plan-making process we need to have certainty, we think we have got sufficient certainty and confidence in terms of the policies and proposals in the plan to know that we can deliver as developments come forward. Many of the developments are not going to come forward in the first 5 years of the plan period. It's not appropriate to have the level of detail that is being expected of us. And as you've heard in many other plans, that's not something that's been required by inspectors at the examination of those plans, and has happened, and the final strategy has indeed been developed after the adoption of those plans. In terms of the, I think we've talked about Jessel Green and Limes Farm. We do acknowledge that the updated HRA, paragraph 5.30, sets out what Mr. Alteras described. However, the Council is of the view that the size and character of the spaces as such, they do not provide the same type of recreational experience as that provided by the Special Area of Conservation. Whilst in the case of LOUR 5, there will be a reduction in terms of the quantum of open space. However, a significant area will be retained and enhanced such that it has the potential to become a more attractive space for recreational purposes for both existing and future residents. And consequently, the Council considers that the allocation of this site is justified. We are also looking at alternative off-site SANG provision, and including, and I think we must include and consider whether or not some of the Epping Forest buffer land could be and could provide an alternative SANG, and that is something that we need to continue to have conversations about.
Are you able to place any kind of timetable on the finalisation of the mitigation strategy?
Well, sadly, we're dependent on others to develop this, and one of the factors is getting comments from a range of different stakeholders and ensuring that we can. So I'd say it's not completely within our control. Obviously, we're keen to move that forward as quickly as possible. Because, as I've said to you before, particularly around the air quality issue, we are currently not able to issue planning permissions unless individual sites have done an appropriate assessment.
Thank you. Mr. Altras, is it a very quick point? I don't want to talk about Jessel Green now, because we'll be talking about that in the future.
DM6 says nothing about the 100 dwellings.
Okay. Well, we'll come back. I think just to set the scene a little bit. I think we're all quite tired now. I know that I am, and I don't want to have a sort of a very long and detailed discussion about these policies, because essentially I think people's overarching concerns is that they don't deal with the situation for all of the reasons we've heard this morning. So if you can just perhaps turn your minds while we're at the break to sort of raise your key points about what you think those policies need to do to be effective, even if there's sort of more work that's required to support them. I think that would be helpful, because there's no benefit in us talking about the detailed wording of the policy if actually the concerns are sort of broader than that. So that's perhaps the context in which we'll have that discussion. Let's have a break until 5:15, and thank you to anyone who's got to go. Thank you. Make a start. The remaining policies from matter 16, which is DM2, Epping Forest SAC and the Lee Valley SPA, and DM22, air quality. You can see that the questions that I've put there on the agenda, but I think that hopefully everybody's received a copy of the council's proposed modifications to these policies. I wonder if, first of all, I could ask the council just to sort of give us its views on the intended purpose, if you like, of both of these policies, because obviously clearly DM2 seems to concern specifically the Epping Forest SAC, whereas the DM22 I think is more has wider intentions than that. So perhaps if you could sort of clarify the intended purposes of these policies and to which development it's supposed to relate, and then again you can see the questions that I've listed on the agenda. I think my concerns broadly relate to whether or not the policies, particularly DM2, in light of what we've heard today, whether it's specific enough. Because, for example, there's no mention in here of any of the sort of zones of influence, or what scale of development is required to do what. Yet there is something very specific in part to what's proposed now to be D about the 400 metres of the SAC, which again I'd ask you to perhaps explain. So I wonder whether it's your intention to sort of leave the detail of those matters to the mitigation strategy rather than putting them in the policy, and if that's the case, why? So if I stop there for now and perhaps just ask the council to talk us through it, and then we can ask for any concerns around the table. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam. I think, as you described it, is broadly correct. The policy on Epping Forest SAC and the Lee Valley Special Protection Area are specific to mitigating the impacts on those two areas. The air quality one is of more general application across the district, but not just dealing with the impact on air quality on the forest. If I talk you through what we've tried to do, obviously this was written some time ago, and before we developed the interim mitigation strategy and so on. And so what we've tried to do is to update the text. In paragraph 4.17 of the supporting text, we've particularly tried to address the development of projects, including off-site measures and including through financial contributions. Listening to the debate earlier, we haven't actually included that within the revisions to the policy, but it might be sensible for us to do so to enable us to collect financial contributions towards SANGs or off-site mitigation, should that be appropriate. What we've also tried to do is to clarify from the strategic level the policies that apply to both Epping Forest, SAC and the Lee Valley. So those are the new parts A and B. So effectively C has moved to B and B's moved to C, as it were. And the new part C is just to make reference, as requested by Natural England, to refer to the mitigation strategies in the policy itself. The reason for not putting in the zone of influence is because, as we've already discussed earlier today, the zone of influence may change in terms of its distance. And in order to ensure that the policy endures across the plan period, we didn't want to be specific, but to make reference to it in the supporting text of the latest visitor survey information, and which is in paragraph 4.25, and to recognise that since it might change, the best way of dealing with that was to make sure that the up-to-date information is on the council's website. So that's the reason for not including a zone of influence. And I think, given what we've heard today, we would maintain that. Whilst it's 6.2 kilometres at the moment, it may well change as a result of updated visitor information. In relation to the question that you've posed about the rationale for not including including the 400 metre threshold that's to deal with the urbanisation effects rather than the recreational pressure impact. And that relates to a piece of research which was undertaken for the Thames Basin Heath Special Protection Area, which looked at the effects of urbanisation and separated out the impact of cat migration from other forms of urbanisation, as we've identified in Part D. That's including, obviously, fly tipping and introduction of non-native plant species, etc. And the research identified the distance to be between 400 to 500 metres of the boundary for other urbanising effects. And that's why we've determined the 400-metre boundary. Do you want me to go on in terms of the air quality policy, or shall I stop?
No, if you stop there for a minute, I think again just a couple of things that occur to me, and I might not be right, and it'll be interesting to see what other people around the table think. But again, I'm just wondering if it's particularly clear in the policy wording itself, which developments and where are likely to have these sort of significant effects. I think that it just seems to be a bit of a mix between air quality and the recreational impacts. And whilst you can't necessarily define the extent of the zone of influence within the policy, maybe by including the words the zone of influence within the policy, so that would clarify which developments are likely to have an effect in terms of recreation, whereas I think from our discussion earlier, it was basically all development in the district is likely to have an effect on air quality. It's just if there's anything that can be done to make it clearer which developments and where and of what scale, if needs be, are likely to have to respond to this policy.
We're happy to take that away and look at it.
Okay. That's all from me for now. Any comments on DM2? Thank you. Mr. Greaves, do you want to just say hello and say who you are first of all, new face? Thank you.
I'm the junior counsellor for the Conservatives, so I'm going to deal with the policy matters.
Thank you.
And I'm conscious of the time, and I just want to therefore set up 3 broad points, and I'll then deal with those in turn. The first point is that we've set out in some detail in our Matter 16 hearing statement, Appendix 2 to that, we set out a table which goes through all the suggested changes in terms of detailed policy changes that we would like to see to, and our comments for that, that we would like to see made to policy DM2. And those are set out there. I don't propose to go through all of those in any detail, and particularly given sort of the more substantive matters that we've already covered, but they're there, and if there are any additional points that need to be made in relation to those, then Ms Hoskin can make those points. But that's where our comments on suggested changes will be found. The second point is that, and that again should go without saying, but none of those policy changes that are set out there address the substantive points that have already been raised today. So there is the substantive objections that have been raised in those points, and these are sort of policy drafting points that, but they don't go to the heart of the issues that have already been considered. And then the third point is relates to a suggestion that's been made in the hearing statement regarding splitting policy DM2. So you have 2 policies, one which would deal with the Lee Valley and one which would deal specifically with Epping Forest. And there are 2 principal reasons for why the Conservatives think that would be a good idea. Firstly, it's clear, and that's come out again from the discussion today, that the key issues regarding impacts on HRA impacts relate to Epping Forest, not the Lee Valley. So a number of the impacts all relate to Epping Forest, and we think for that reason it'd be sensible to have 2 separate policies, so one can clearly look at the policy that deals with Epping Forest. The second reason is that, and the explanatory text, and again that goes to the points that you've been making, Marm, in relation to sort of drilling down a bit more into the detail, because if we had a policy just dealing with Epping Forest, then it would be easier for that to be worded and phrased in a way which wasn't sort of clunky. If it was trying to deal with both the Lee Valley and also Epping Forest, it would be easier to frame it and to frame the explanatory text in a way that supported it. The other reason for why we think that would be a good idea is because, as well as the SAC, the designated part of Epping Forest, there is also the other areas of the forest, so the buffer lands as well. And we think if you had one policy that dealt with Epping Forest, it would be possible also to make sure that those areas and the importance of those areas and their interrelationship with the designated areas could be considered in one holistic way. And again, that then feeds into the explanatory text and affording the explanatory text an opportunity to deal with those points. So that's why we think it would be a good idea to split DM2 in that way. The Conservatives would be very happy to engage with the Council going forwards on any amendments that might be made to it, or any alternative words if that would assist. So that's what we'd like to do. And thirdly, if it wasn't deemed appropriate to split the policy, we'd at very least like some inclusion in the explanatory text relating to the other parts of the forest, because at the moment they're not picked up in policy DM1 because that relates more generally to biodiversity, and they're not picked up in policy DM2. So we'd just like to make sure that those parts aren't forgotten.
Thank you. Hoskin.
Thank you. As has just been said, the detail of what we suggest is in that appendix to Matter 16. I just wanted to pick up on the one part relating to the 400-metre zone. And there were two things there. That 400 metres, as has been said, relates to urbanisation impacts, which can be in addition to recreation itself. So noise, lighting, fire, fly tipping, for example. And the 400-metre zone has been used elsewhere. The HRA doesn't go into detail in assessing urbanisation impacts specifically for Epping Forest, which is a point we've raised. The 400 metres may be appropriate, or it may be better to have a different zone, and that would be informed by actual assessment of urbanisation impacts specific to Epping Forest. And the Conservatives have started to think about that, but there is a suggestion that could possibly be 800 metres. But we'd like to see more assessment on that in the HRA. We think that's a gap in the HRA at the moment, and that would then inform that part of the policy. And then I would just also add that a lot of policies that use that close zone to exclude for urbanisation impacts tend to word it as a presumption against development, which is slightly stronger than is currently stated. So that there's a presumption against, and then if a development comes forward that may be able to demonstrate it is exceptional and doesn't cause any urbanisation impacts, they can do that through project level HRA. But other policies similar to that elsewhere have used a presumption against.
And on what basis why do you think that the 400-metre zone wouldn't be applicable here? I mean, again, I can hear you sort of asking for more work to prove that it is, but what is there that suggests that it isn't, if you like? We want to do more work for no reason.
Yeah, no, it could be applicable. As the Councillor explained, it's been used widely elsewhere. It tends to be used for a number of reasons, and that includes domestic cats and average ranging distances for domestic cats predating on ground nesting birds. That's not the only reason for the choice of 400 metres, but where there's a special protection area with ground nesting birds, then that is used. The forest has particular specific urbanisation risks that we think warrant more consideration to decide whether 400 metres is applicable or whether it should be something different.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Madam, just to take if you like, the last point first about 400 metres, we've submitted a paper that doesn't appear to have been printed out and circulated to everyone today, but on Matter 16, and we've queried this 400 metres because, as was just explained, it was originally set in relation to the Thames Basin heaths because of cats and whether they would attack ground nesting birds or their nests, and that was the logic behind the 400 metres. There aren't ground nesting birds here. The question here is, are local residents likely to be using the site for either for recreation or other activities? And so we've suggested another possible radius for those activities might be 10 minutes walk, which is defined by the Epping Forest Open Spaces strategy as 720 metres. But in any event, we don't think 400 metres is, it seems somewhat arbitrary as a distance. Just addressing the details of the policy, what I say is clearly without prejudice to the substance of the concerns that we've raised. Just in respect of DM2, first of all, the concern, a particular concern is with the phrase meaningful proportion in relation to natural space. Possibly we could swap that for sufficient, because I mean the key thing is that there is sufficient alternative green space, and what of course we've asked for is that there be a strategy in place that you can then use to judge the plan on. It would be sensible to cross-refer to that strategy, but accepting that if some other unforeseen site came forward, potentially they could do something different if they could justify that by way of project-level assessment. But what we'd like to see is sufficient natural green space, either in accordance with that adopted strategy or on some other basis. And then what's going to be paragraph C, where there are amendments now suggested, on air quality, if we look at the wording, it's about halfway down, the words have been added in or can be put in place. That really needs to be will be put in place, because, again, we're trying to ensure that the measures are going to be in place in time to prevent or mitigate those activities. So I don't know why or can be has been added, but will be put in place is probably the right thing there. And then, in respect to the amendment in C that's been added at the end, we don't really understand why there's been an addition after council. It should say measures will include those identified in the most up-to-date mitigation strategy, full stop. It's not clear what's added by the rest of that. And I think it's probably worth raising as well that insofar as there are particular mitigation measures that are going to be required from a particular piece of land, although it isn't obviously for us to give legal advice to the competent authority, it would appear to us that you need to adopt whatever that strategy is as a supplementary planning document, because if you look at the definition of Section 17 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, and then how local development documents are then defined in the Local Planning Regulations 2012, it says the documents that are to be prepared as local development documents are any document prepared by a local authority individually or in cooperation with others which contains statements regarding one or more of the following: the development and use of land which the local planning authority wish to encourage during any specified period, the allocation of sites, any environmental or other objectives which are relevant to the attainment of the development and use of land. So we're going to need some sort of SPD probably, and then what we'd like to see is whatever that strategy is prepared, so that you have got something you can base your judgment on of soundness on, and then recognising that may then be updated subsequently if circumstances change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Altras.
Paragraph B applies to all residential development within the zone of influence, which is defined only in paragraph 4.25, where there must be first a finding that the proposal is likely to have a significant effect on the SAC, and second, if so, demonstrate that adequate measures to avoid or mitigate, and third, such measures must include up-to-date what is required in an up-to-date mitigation framework, leaving open, of course, the possibility of there being other unidentified measures that would be required. Now, if you compare that, Madam, with C, remembering that Loughton is within the zone of influence, all residential applications in Loughton must make financial contributions. There's no cross-reference there to the up-to-date mitigation framework, and no suggestion that other measures may be required. There is a reference only to in accordance with a visitor survey. What the visitor survey has got to do with measures being required is a little unclear. Paragraph D relates to additional developments, and one is entitled to ask, additional to what? And also strategic developments, which are what? The 4 sites, the 4 large sites, or those sites that require a master plan, because if it's those sites that require a master plan, then Jessel Green requires a master plan. They must provide SANGs. We have suggested elsewhere that housing development in Loughton could be required to provide SANGs, as we set out in paragraph 13 of our hearing statement. And we heard today that it's likely that at some stage there will be a requirement for development sites providing over 100 houses will also require either SANGs or something else. So, if I may say, Adam, this requires a considerable amount of re-amendment perhaps, in order to make it quite clear what is being sought by the authority as a matter of policy.
Thank you, Mr. Pond.
Sorry, Madam, just moving a microphone. I wanted to take up a point which was raised by Mr. Graham and Ms. Hoskin about the 400-metre, 720-metre, etc. Zone. We in Loughton did not raise this in our hearing statement because we weren't aware that it's coming up, but we have immediately adjoining the forest 3 conservation areas which are in effect an extension of the SAC from a point of view of wildlife, the interchange of wildlife with the gardens adjoining, and the survival of flora from the pre-1879 pattern within the forest. And I think the phrase presumption against development in that area is probably a well-founded one, because it will extensive development of any kind within that zone would interfere with the well-being of the SAC.
Thank you. Just a couple of points that I want to ask the council, so I'm not sure how far we'll be able to take it today in any case. A general point raised by Mr. Graham, it's Mr. Graham, isn't it? I've forgotten by the end, Mr. Graham, about this sort of relying on documents, if you like, that are outside of the plan. So it's a question that will come up again, I think, in relation to the IDP. I just wonder if, I don't know if Mr. Beard were able to help us at all, or anything about setting requirements in documents that aren't within the plan. And I think the answer that we've been given in relation to the IDP, in relation to infrastructure, is that the key items of infrastructure must be within the plan. And then you refer to the IDP sort of as a living document to update that. I don't know if there's any similarity here, or how comfortable the council is on putting all of its requirements in a document that sits outside the plan. That's as a general question. And then my second question is a far simpler one, because we've heard lots of detailed sort of representations being raised about the content of the policy and the format of the policy. I've raised a couple of points that I'm not sure that it's not terribly specific about what's required of what development, of what scale and where, excepting that you need to maintain some flexibility. Do you have any fundamental issues or objections to getting together with the parties to agree the wording? Because I think you've done similar with Historic England, for example, and that's that's been very helpful, and rather than sort of spend a long time here trying to deal with it. But that obviously then places a requirement on the other parties to do that in a timely fashion and a constructive, pragmatic way. So it's not just the council; it would be the other parties to sign up to that and to be committed to that. I think that would be helpful to me.
We emphatically agree, if
Okay.
I may say so. In respect of the matter, the first matter you raised, Madam, it's clear that there's clear law on the point. Certain, having regard to the provisions of Part 2 of the 2004 Act and the relevant provisions of the 2012 local planning regulations, certain matters must be dealt with in development plan documents, and other matters having regard to, I think it's Regulation 5, I may be wrong about that, must be included, are prescribed that must be included in SPDs. There is a category of residual local development documents that have been acknowledged by the courts, but clearly these policies, or this policy, all policies, but in respect of this policy, it's right to say that matters that must be in a a development plan document must appear in the policy, and we'll take care to ensure when we reconsider these policies, this policy in particular, that it refers the matters that must be dealt with in the development plan document are included within the policy, and insofar as it's necessary for any other matters to be included within a local development document that is an SPD, I'll give the council advice on that.
Thank you. Mr. Pinnock.
Just briefly, Ma'am, I mean, our position remains that you have a policy of whatever persuasion or detailed wording. If it's going to be fixed and fixed again, then it's welcome that it's more detailed and more robust than it currently is, because certainly our position is that it's not fit for purpose. But either way, it leads back through to a mitigation strategy, which isn't in front of the examination, and takes us back through. It seems that even the detailed session on the policy has led the key parties back to the conclusion that the evidence base is not sound. So, welcome the detailed changes to the policy, but all those roads lead back to uncertainty.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. As I know it's difficult to...
Not a hugely constructive contribution, but
no.
True. I
hope. Please be assured that I've taken that point from the long discussion that we've had today. But I guess it's difficult. But this is the only real opportunity we've got to discuss them. And so eventually, it would be good if the wording was as neat as it could be. Okay, let's move on to air quality, unless it can be dealt with by saying that you'll work with Natural England and the Conservators.
Well, we will. We will.
Okay.
We're happy to answer any questions you may have, or assist as best we can.
Okay. Perhaps if Ms. Bond Cooper tells us what you were going to, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Madam. I think what we've sought to do, and I hope everyone's got a copy of the circulated revisions that we're proposing to the supporting text and the policy itself. In relation to the question that you've asked about whether any requirements are required in order to ensure the protection of Epping Forest SAC, we are proposing, for the sake of clarity, to make amendments to Part B, paragraph 4.162, in order to make reference to the mitigation strategy for the Epping Forest SAC. And those changes are set out as underlined in paragraph B of the policy and in paragraph 4.162. In the reference to larger proposals in Part C relates to air quality considerations other than those relating to the Epping Forest SAC. The Council's local validation checklist, EB 912, provides guidance as to the types of proposals that would be required to undertake this. Because that applies to a range of activities and developments, we don't consider it appropriate to provide more specificity. But we do propose a modification to the supporting text at paragraph 4.163 to provide greater clarity. We're thinking here about proposals for biomass burning for heat, or where there are development proposals introducing new receptors to areas with existing pollution sources. That's all I was going to say.
Thank you. Mr. Greaves.
I'll be brief, and the points are simply that I think at this stage it's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion about the drafting of this policy and the extent of it, given the substantive objections. But clearly, we would welcome the opportunity to discuss drafting at a sensible stage. And when it comes to matters of drafting, it's much easier for the parties to get together on these sorts of issues and to work together in the drafting to make sure that it's everyone can agree appropriate wording, and that's a very helpful suggestion. So when it comes to including more detailed points and securing mitigation, then certainly we can would be happy to work with the council on those points.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I would endorse those comments. I mean, it seems to us we can tighten up the wording and also probably reduce its length by about half, because it's very verbose and bits do seem to overlap, but it's not probably something that's a useful use of examination time to do.
Thank you. Mr. Pinnock.
Super quick. It's just a question. I don't understand probably lots of things by the end of the day, but principally what this stage is, where there'll be this sort of beer and sandwiches chat, about what the plan's going to look like and how it's all going to work, great. I don't understand what that stage is, where it's an examination in public of a plan with, most sensitive SAC you've ever heard of, etc. And we're here to, I know this is terribly unfair, because obviously we're trying to grapple with lots of different things at the DM scale and then, the macro scale in terms of evidence. But in terms of having sort of fair opportunity to input into that, there's one issue there, but also fundamentally, just to make it crystal clear, the real concern that we have is how it is possible to reach a soundness conclusion, let alone the legal test in terms of HRA, but how can a soundness conclusion be drawn, other than a very negative one, on justification and effectiveness, in circumstances where the thing which is the thing that's being secured by the policy, the mitigation strategy, isn't here, not going to be here by the time you get to end the examination, don't know when it's going to happen, it's not in the council's control. That's a fundamental point, and I don't wish to sort of be seen to acquiesce in the idea that somehow this could be fixed by wording in the policy, because any policy wording which goes back to that mitigation strategy.
Well, as I tried to explain a moment ago, obviously as a result of today, that's the fundamental points that I need to consider, and I'll need to go away and consider that. And if I decide that the plan can't proceed without a mitigation strategy being in place, then clearly your position that then writing a policy about it would be utterly pointless. And I do realise that. But as I said at the beginning when I was asked, I'm not going to reach that position today. And so, because we've heard a lot of...
I wasn't trying to push you across the line.
But we've heard a lot of good and technical arguments, I would say, on both sides of the table, and I need to have some time to consider those and to weigh them. And at the moment, I remain open-minded about the view that I'm going to reach, and so I'm just trying to discuss what would happen with the DM policies in the event that I were to find that the plan were or could be made sound. So that's the reason for discussing them. It doesn't mean I've lost the points that there's a fundamental concern about whether or not we need a mitigation strategy to be completed today.
Thank you, ma'am, and I'm grateful. I mean, my concern, I suppose, my question still is, because the mitigation strategy is not going to be finished by the time, I'm sorry if this is delaying Mr. Beard, but because the mitigation strategy is not going to be finished, we know, and we don't know when it will be finished. And because the mitigation strategy is core to the policy, if you conclude that everything's fine in relation to, or it's good enough in relation to the evidence base, and then you proceed into the policy is reliant on the mitigation strategy, but we don't know what that is. And because we don't know what it is, how can we then have a foundation for a conclusion on soundness in terms of justification and effectiveness? And unless so that there's...
I think that's the point you've made already, and that I've answered to the best of my ability today. I think that's the same points that we've just discussed. It's certainly the same points that I just intended to answer.
I'm sorry, I'm really not trying to delay, but it's purely that if you reach the position that the evidence is there to allow, you know, the plan to reach, then, if you like, the next stage of examination, or whatever you want to call it, like the detailed grappling with the terms of the policy, inescapably the policy itself is requiring reliance in terms of finding of soundness on the mitigation strategy. So putting aside entirely the issue which you unfortunately have got to grapple with in terms of HRA compliance and all that kind of stuff, going to the primary function of determining soundness against the tests, in circumstances where a policy refers to mitigation strategy that will not exist at the point of the writing of your report, I suppose. This is just to record that we have concerns whether that's actually possible to safely reach that conclusion. That was all I wanted to conclude.
A simple point: if you have to implement a mitigation strategy which isn't there, how do you do it?
If you have to reach a view on a mitigation strategy as part of determination of plan soundness,
yes,
but it doesn't exist.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The only point I would make is that the mitigation strategy is like to change over the time of the plan period, and that's why we wouldn't want to be more specific than that in the policy.
Again, a last question, and then we'll give up for today. But just to perhaps test my understanding of what Mr. Pinnock was saying, if the plan is found sound, and we have the mitigation strategy in the policy, if it hasn't been finished at all, let alone updated and it's a living document, if there isn't one, as there isn't today, how will a planning application comply with the mitigation strategy? How will you do we at least have to say that the mitigation strategy has to be completed upon the adoption of the plan in order that someone who comes in to try to comply with DM22 can refer to it? Because if it isn't there, they can't refer to it. I think that's the sort of second point that Mr. Pinnock was making.
Madam, as I just described earlier, we have an interim mitigation strategy for recreational pressure. We have a draft air quality strategy and agreement from the portfolio holder to sign up to that as soon as possible. We will be, on the back of the visitor survey, I'm sure, revisiting it later in the year after that. But we will have a strategy. We may not have, the full strategy, but we will have an air quality strategy in place, I hope, before you report, madam.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll leave it. I think we'll leave it there now. It's 5 to 6. Thank you very much. It's been a long day. Thank you for your contribution.